We are glad to see you again. In this story for sleep, we will tell you about a great warrior whose name became a symbol of freedom itself, Spartacus. His story is not just one of battles, but of the unquenchable human spirit that refuses to be broken. In the 1st century before the birth of Christ, the Roman Republic was the undisputed master of the known world. To an outside observer, it was a marvel of human achievement. Its legions, disciplined and seemingly invincible, had crushed proud kingdoms from the Iberian Peninsula to the shores of Asia Minor. Its engineers had woven a web of stone roads across the continent and built aqueducts that carried fresh water for hundreds of miles, feats that would not be equaled for another 1,000 years. In the heart of this empire, the city of Rome itself was a chaotic, vibrant hub of power. In its forum, senators in white togas debated the fate of millions, while its markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the world. Silks from the east, grain from Africa, amber from the north. Its temples, clad in brilliant marble, stood as monuments to the gods who had seemingly blessed Rome with eternal dominion. But this gleaming facade of order and prosperity concealed a dark and rotting core. The Republic was a society built on a series of brutal contradictions. The immense wealth plundered from conquered lands did not enrich the Roman people. It flowed into the coffers of a tiny, insatiable elite. These aristocratic families, whose names were etched into the history of the Republic, lived lives of almost unimaginable luxury. They built sprawling villas on the coasts, decorated with intricate mosaics and priceless statues, where they would recline on plush couches and feast on exotic delicacies, their tables groaning under the weight of imported wines and rare foods. This entire edifice of opulent civilization, however, rested upon a foundation of profound and widespread human suffering. The engine that powered Rome's economy, that tilled its fields and mined its silver, was slavery. It was the dark secret behind the Republic's greatness. The very same wars that brought glory and riches to the senatorial class brought chains and despair to countless others. With every successful campaign, tens of thousands of captives were herded back to Italy. They were Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Thracians, men, women, and children who had once had homes and families. Now they stood shivering on cold stone platforms in the bustling slave markets, stripped of their dignity as potential buyers inspected their teeth and muscles, prodding them like livestock. Families were torn apart without a second thought, their cries unheard over the din of commerce. Their lives, their skills, their very bodies ceased to be their own. They became property. These slaves were channeled into the vast agricultural factories known as the latifundia. The small, independent farms that had once been the bedrock of Roman society were vanishing, unable to compete. A citizen soldier might spend years fighting for the Republic on some distant frontier, only to return home to find his family farm foreclosed and swallowed by a wealthy neighbor's estate. These latifundia were not farms. They were rural prisons designed for ruthless efficiency. Armies of slaves, often branded with the mark of their owner, would labor from before sunrise to after sunset, tending olive groves or harvesting wheat under a relentless sun. At night, they were locked away in wretched windowless barracks called ergastula, dank, subterranean cells where disease and despair were rampant. Roman law offered these people no protection because in the eyes of the law they were not people at all. The great Roman statesman Cato the Elder famously advised landowners to sell off their old or sick slaves, just as they would a broken cart or a worn-out ox. The legal term for a slave was instrumentum vocale, a talking tool. This chilling phrase reveals the absolute dehumanization at the heart of the system. A slave had no right to marry, no right to own property, and no right to his own children, who were born into the same state of servitude. A master possessed the power of life and death over his talking tools. He could beat them, torture them, or kill them for any reason, or for no reason at all, with complete impunity. This system was not just cruel. It was a powder keg. By concentrating millions of dispossessed and brutalized people within its borders, Rome had created a vast internal enemy. Crucially, these were not people born into a lifetime of submission. Many were proud warriors, captured in battle, who understood military discipline and tactics. They remembered freedom, and that memory was a poison that bred a deep, simmering hatred for their Roman masters. In the darkness of the mines, in the sweltering heat of the fields, and in the suffocating confines of the ergastula, the embers of rebellion were glowing, waiting for a leader, a spark, to ignite a firestorm that would shake the foundations of the mighty republic. The simmering hatred that festered within the slave population was not merely a social issue. It was a constant, low-grade fever burning at the very heart of Rome's economic life. To truly grasp the world that created Spartacus, one must understand that slavery was not a peripheral aspect of Roman society. It was its central pillar, the engine that drove its agriculture, its industries, and the luxurious lifestyles of its elite. The scale of this institution is difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. Conservative estimates suggest that by the 1st century BC, between 25 and 40% of the population of Italy consisted of slaves. In a city like Rome, with nearly 1 million inhabitants, this meant hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. For every 3 free citizens walking the streets, there were likely 2 slaves toiling in the background, unseen and unheard. This vast, disposable workforce was constantly replenished from several primary sources, each one a river of human misery flowing into the great reservoir of the Roman economy. The most significant source, by far, was warfare. The Roman war machine was not just a tool of conquest. It was the most efficient slave harvesting operation in history. Slave traders, known as mongones, followed the legions on their campaigns like vultures circling a battlefield. After a Roman victory, while the legionaries secured the area, these traders would move in, buying up thousands of captives directly from the generals. These prisoners, men, women, and older children, were shackled into long columns and forced to march, sometimes for months, back to the slave markets of Italy. Entire tribes and peoples were effectively erased from their homelands and absorbed into the Roman system, their collective identity shattered. A second, and more unpredictable, source of slaves was piracy. In the 1st century BC, the Mediterranean was not the peaceful Roman lake it would later become. It was terrorized by fleets of Cilician pirates, who operated with near impunity from their strongholds in modern-day Turkey. These were not simple brigands. They were a highly organized naval power. Their swift ships would raid coastal towns, attack merchant vessels, and kidnap travelers, including wealthy Romans who would then be held for a high ransom. Those less fortunate were sold at pirate-run slave markets on islands like Delos, which became a notorious hub for this illicit trade. The constant threat of piracy meant that no one, not even a free Roman citizen, was entirely safe from the horror of enslavement. Finally, the system was designed to be self-sustaining. Children born to a slave mother automatically became the property of her master. These slaves, known as verni, were often raised within the household. While this might have spared them the initial trauma of capture and separation, their fate was arguably more tragic. They were born into a world where they had no legal father, no family name, and no prospect of freedom. From their first breath, they were groomed for a life of servitude, a chilling testament to the generational nature of this institution. Once in Roman hands, the life of a slave could vary dramatically depending on their skills, origin, and sheer luck. At the absolute bottom of this cruel hierarchy were the slaves condemned to the mines and quarries. This was a death sentence. Chained and working in perpetual darkness, they would hack at rock faces to extract silver, lead, and stone, breathing in toxic dust until their lungs gave out. Life expectancy in the mines was measured in months, not years. Barely above them were the agricultural slaves of the latifundia, whose lives of relentless toil we have already glimpsed. In the cities, however, the picture was more complex. A vast number of slaves worked in domestic settings. A wealthy Roman household was a small army of enslaved servants, each with a specific role: cooks, cleaners, hairdressers, and body servants. Educated Greeks were highly prized as tutors, or pedagogi, responsible for the education of the master's children. Others served as scribes, accountants, and administrators, effectively running their master's business affairs. While their material conditions were far superior to those of a mined slave, their freedom was just as illusory. They lived in constant intimacy with their owners, subject to their every whim, their kindness one day and their explosive, violent anger the next. There was even a class of slaves owned not by individuals, but by the state. These were the servi publici, or public slaves. They maintained temples, repaired aqueducts, and worked as clerks in the state archives. Their position was generally more secure than that of a privately owned slave, but they were still property, cogs in the vast machine of the Roman state. This intricate system, with its countless roles and hierarchies, permeated every aspect of Roman life. It suppressed wages for the free poor, who could not compete with unpaid labor. It also stifled technological innovation. There was little incentive to invent labor-saving machinery when an endless supply of human muscle was so readily available. This complete dependence on slavery was the bedrock of Rome's power, but it was also its greatest vulnerability. It had created a diverse society of the unfree, from the cultured Greek tutor to the brutalized Thracian miner, who shared nothing but the chains that bound them and a common oppressor. It was a vulnerability that had been tested before. And indeed, that vulnerability had been tested before, not in the heart of Italy, but on the sun-scorched island of Sicily. Decades before a single gladiator sharpened a kitchen knife in Capua, Sicily had already served as the bloody stage for two massive slave rebellions, known to history as the First and Second Servile Wars. These were not minor riots. They were full-scale conflicts that lasted for years, required the deployment of consular armies, and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. They served as a terrifying dress rehearsal for the main event, and their lessons, both learned and ignored, would echo powerfully in the story of Spartacus. Sicily was Rome's first major overseas province, its original breadbasket. The island had been transformed into a landscape of enormous latifundia, even more so than the Italian mainland. Wealthy Roman and Italian landowners, often living far away in luxury, owned vast tracts of land worked by colossal armies of slaves. These slaves were largely former Greek and Syrian captives, thrown together in brutal conditions under the watch of merciless overseers. The sheer concentration of enslaved people, combined with the absentee nature of their masters, made Sicily a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in 135 BC. The revolt began, as they often do, as a reaction to the extreme cruelty of a single master. A wealthy landowner named Demophilus and his wife, Megalis, were notorious for their sadistic treatment of their slaves. They starved them, beat them, and branded them without cause. Driven past the point of endurance, a group of 400 of their slaves armed themselves and stormed their master's villa. They butchered Demophilus and forced his wife to watch, before handing her over to her own female slaves, who tortured her to death. This single act of vengeance ignited the island. The rebellion found its unlikely leader in a Syrian slave named Eunice. He was not a warrior, but a charismatic mystic and a self-proclaimed prophet. He performed magic tricks, claimed to receive visions from the goddess Arrogance, and famously learned to breathe sparks and flames by hiding a nutshell filled with burning material in his mouth. To the desperate and superstitious slaves, he was a divine figure. He was proclaimed king, and under his command, the rebellion spread like wildfire. Slaves across the island rose up, killing their masters and seizing control of towns and cities, including the major stronghold of Enna. The rage that was unleashed was terrifying. The slaves repaid a generation of cruelty with their own wave of indiscriminate slaughter. For a time, it seemed the established order had been completely overturned. Rome, arrogant and distracted by wars in Spain, was slow to react. They initially sent small, inadequate forces, which the slave armies, swollen now to a reported 200,000 strong, easily defeated. It took 3 years of brutal warfare and the dispatch of multiple consular armies to finally corner and crush the rebellion. The Roman retribution was absolute. The slave king, Eunice, was captured and thrown into a dungeon to rot. Thousands of his followers who were taken alive were subjected to the ultimate punishment designed to inflict maximum terror: crucifixion. A forest of crosses lined the roads of Sicily, a grotesque and public warning to any other slave who dared to dream of freedom. One might think such a horrifying event would have taught the Roman elite a lesson. It did not. Less than a generation later, in 104 BC, the island exploded once more. This time, the trigger was an ill-conceived political decision. Faced with a military threat from Germanic tribes in the north, Rome needed more soldiers. The Senate issued a decree that any citizen of an allied state who had been illegally enslaved by Roman tax collectors should be freed. The governor of Sicily began to comply, releasing several hundred slaves. But the wealthy landowners, furious at the prospect of losing their free labor, pressured him to stop. When the governor reversed his decision, the thousands of slaves who had been promised freedom and then had it snatched away erupted in fury. This Second Servile War was, in many ways, even more dangerous than the first. Its leaders were not mystics, but competent military commanders. A slave named Salvius was elected king, taking the name Tryphon, and he organized a disciplined army. He was soon joined by a Greek slave named Athenian, another skilled commander. Together, they defeated Roman forces, captured major cities, and controlled large portions of the island for 4 long years. They established a functioning kingdom, complete with a royal court and their own coinage. They proved that a slave army could not only fight, but could also govern. Once again, a panicked Rome was forced to divert its full military attention to Sicily. After a long and bloody campaign, the rebellion was finally put down by the consul Manius Aquilius, who reportedly killed Athenian in single combat. The aftermath was a grim repeat of the First War. Mass crucifixions were once again the order of the day. A final group of 1,000 captured rebels were shipped to Rome to be forced to fight wild animals in the arena for the public's entertainment. But in a final, stunning act of defiance, they refused to become a spectacle. Instead of fighting the beasts, they drew their weapons and killed one another, the last man falling on his own sword. These 2 great Sicilian wars left a deep scar on the Roman psyche. They revealed the terrifying potential of an enslaved population to organize and wage war. For the slaves themselves, the stories of these failed rebellions were passed down in hushed whispers. They were lessons in what was possible, that they could rise up and challenge the masters of the world. But they were also a stark reminder of the price of failure: a slow, agonizing death upon a cross. For the Roman masters, the lesson was simpler and far more cynical. The system was not the problem. The problem was a lack of vigilance. Instead of considering reform, they concluded that the only answer to the threat of rebellion was more control, more brutality, and the application of overwhelming, merciless force at the first sign of trouble. They grew complacent once more, believing the danger was confined to that troublesome island. They could not imagine that the next and greatest firestorm would ignite not in a distant province, but in the very heart of Italy itself. The complacency of the Roman elite was not born purely of arrogance, but also of distraction. While the embers of the Sicilian revolts were still cooling, the masters of the Republic had become consumed by a far more immediate and, to them, far more important conflict: a brutal power struggle with one another. The violence that they had for so long exported to the far corners of the world had finally come home to roost. The generation before Spartacus witnessed the complete breakdown of the old Republican order, as ambitious generals and ruthless politicians tore the state apart in a bloody civil war. This was the world that shaped the men Spartacus would have to fight. The conflict centered around two titans of Roman politics: Gaius Marius, a celebrated general who had reformed the army, and his ambitious former subordinate Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their rivalry, fueled by personal pride and political ambition, escalated into a full-blown war. For the first time in its long history, a Roman general, Sulla, committed the ultimate sacrilege. He marched his own legions on the sacred city of Rome. The unspoken rule that the army must never cross the city's boundaries was shattered, and with it, the foundation of the Republic's stability. The streets of Rome, which had not seen an enemy army for centuries, ran red with the blood of its own citizens as Sulla seized control. But this was only the beginning. When Sulla was away on campaign in the east, Marius and his allies retook the city and unleashed their own reign of terror, slaughtering Sulla's supporters. When Sulla finally returned in 82 BC, victorious and bent on vengeance, he brought with him a new and terrifying political weapon: the proscription. It was a concept of chilling simplicity. Sulla posted a list in the public forum, a death list containing the names of his enemies. Anyone whose name appeared on this list was declared an outlaw and an enemy of the state. Their legal protections were stripped away. They could be hunted down and killed by anyone, with the killer receiving a handsome reward from the state treasury. But it didn't stop there. The victim's property, their lands, their homes, their wealth, was confiscated and auctioned off by the state. The proscription was not just a tool of political extermination. It was an invitation to a nationwide frenzy of greed, betrayal, and state-sanctioned murder. A web of terror descended upon Italy. Old scores were settled under the guise of political necessity. People pointed fingers at their wealthy neighbors, hoping to see their names appear on the next list so they could claim a share of their property. Sons betrayed fathers, and slaves killed their masters, all for the promise of a reward. It was a time of absolute moral collapse, where the only law was the law of the strong and the ruthless. And in this cauldron of violence and avarice, one young man saw not just chaos, but opportunity. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus came from a noble and wealthy family, but the civil wars had nearly destroyed it. His father and one of his brothers had been killed during the Marian purges. Crassus himself had been forced to flee to Spain, hiding in a cave for months to survive. When Sulla returned, Crassus eagerly joined him, seeking revenge and the restoration of his family's fortunes. But while others were driven purely by vengeance, Crassus was driven by something more: an insatiable hunger for wealth. He saw the proscriptions as the greatest business opportunity of his lifetime. While his contemporaries were busy settling blood feuds, Crassus and his agents were a constant presence at the state auctions. With inside information and a network of spies, he bought up the vast estates of the proscribed for laughably low prices. He acquired silver mines, agricultural lands, and entire blocks of city real estate. His genius for profiting from disaster was legendary. It was said that Rome was a city of frequent fires, and Crassus created his own private fire brigade. When a building caught fire, his brigade would rush to the scene. But they would not start putting out the flames. Instead, Crassus's agent would approach the distraught property owner and offer to buy the burning building, and sometimes the adjacent ones threatened by the fire, for a pittance. If the desperate owner agreed, the brigade would get to work. If not, they would simply stand back and watch it all burn to the ground. Through such ruthless methods, Crassus transformed himself from a dispossessed noble into the single wealthiest man in Rome. Yet, for all his gold, Crassus lacked the one thing a Roman aristocrat craved above all else: military glory or dignitas. He looked on with bitter envy at his younger rival, Gnaeus Pompey, who was already being hailed as Pompey the Great for his victories in Africa and Spain. Crassus had commanded troops for Sulla, and done so effectively, but he had no great independent command to his name. He was seen as a vulture, a profiteer, not a true Roman hero. This deep-seated insecurity, This burning desire to match his wealth with military prestige would become his driving obsession. He was waiting for a chance, any chance, to prove that he was more than just a landlord and a moneylender. He was waiting for a war that would make him a legend. He could never have known that his opportunity would come not from a foreign king, but from a Thracian slave in a gladiator school. While Marcus Crassus was calculating profits in the burning streets of Rome, far to the northeast, in the rugged mountainous lands across the Adriatic Sea, lived the people who would produce his ultimate nemesis. This land was known as Thrace. To the average Roman, Thrace was a wild, uncivilized place on the edge of the known world, a land of harsh winters, dense forests, and fierce, unpredictable tribesmen. It was a place from which Rome sourced gold, timber, and, above all, soldiers. But to understand Spartacus the man, we must look beyond the Roman caricature and see the Thracians as they saw themselves. Thrace, covering parts of modern-day Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey, was not a unified kingdom in the Roman sense. It was a chaotic patchwork of dozens of independent tribes, each with its own chieftain, its own customs, and its own fierce pride. They were a people defined by a love of two things: freedom and warfare. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote of them centuries earlier. If they were ruled by one man, or if they could agree among themselves, they would be the most powerful of all nations. But they could not agree. They spent as much time fighting each other as they did fighting foreign invaders, constantly engaged in raids, skirmishes, and blood feuds. War was not a political tool for them. It was a way of life, the noblest of all professions. A man's worth was measured not by his wealth, but by his courage in battle and his skill with a weapon. Herodotus noted that for the Thracians, to live by war and plunder was most honorable. To till the soil was the most dishonorable. Their appearance was as wild as their reputation. They were often depicted as tall and powerful, with reddish or fair hair and piercing blue eyes. They adorned their bodies with intricate tattoos, swirling patterns that marked their tribal affiliation and status. In battle, they were a fearsome sight. They often fought with a wild, almost ecstatic fury, disdaining the disciplined, methodical warfare of the Roman legion. Their equipment was light, designed for speed and ferocity. They carried small, distinctively shaped shields called pelti, and their primary weapon was the dreaded sicca, a short, curved sword with a forward-angled blade, designed to hook around an opponent's shield and strike at their unprotected side or back. It was a brutal, efficient weapon, and it became so synonymous with assassins and cutthroats that in Rome, the word sicarius, a man of the sicca, came to mean murderer. This obsession with warfare was deeply embedded in their religion. While they worshipped a pantheon of gods, their chief deity was a god of war, whom the Greeks identified with their own Ares, and the Romans with Mars. But the Thracian Ares was a far more primal and bloodthirsty figure. They did not build him temples of marble. They worshipped him in sacred groves, and it was said they practiced human sacrifice, offering up prisoners of war to appease his violent spirit. This warrior cult shaped their entire worldview. They believed in a form of immortality, that death in battle was not an end, but a glorious journey to a better place to feast with their gods. This belief made them almost fearless in combat, giving them a reckless courage that both impressed and terrified their more pragmatic Roman adversaries. Their relationship with Rome was complex and ever-changing. The relentless westward expansion of the Republic had brought the legions to their doorstep. Some Thracian tribes fiercely resisted Roman encroachment, fighting brutal guerrilla wars in their native mountains. Others chose a different path. Recognizing the military prowess of the Thracians, the Romans began to recruit them into their army as auxiliary troops. These were non-citizen soldiers who served alongside the legions, valued for their skills as light infantry and cavalry. A Thracian warrior, tired of intertribal squabbles, could find steady pay and a chance for glory in Roman service. It was a dangerous bargain. He would be fighting for the very empire that was slowly devouring his homeland. This created a world of shifting allegiances, where today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy, and the line between soldier and rebel was often perilously thin. It was from this crucible of fire, freedom, and blood that Spartacus emerged. He was not a product of the rigid, ordered, and hierarchical world of Rome. He was a child of the Thracian wilds, a man raised in a culture that placed personal honor and freedom above all else. He was taught from a young age that a life without liberty was worthless, and that the only noble death was one found on the battlefield. This was the spirit, the untamable warrior ethos, that Rome would attempt to chain and force into an arena for sport. They believed they could break him and turn him into a talking tool. They were about to discover how tragically they had misjudged the man from the lands of the war god. So, who was this Thracian who would bring the world's only superpower to its knees? The frustrating truth is that the man himself is a ghost in the annals of history. The Romans who wrote about him were his enemies. They were not interested in preserving the biography of a slave rebel. They were trying to explain a catastrophe. They tell us what he did, but they offer only fleeting, often contradictory glimpses of who he was before his name became a terror to them. From these scattered fragments, we can piece together three possible versions of his past, each painting a different portrait of the man and his motivations. The first and most straightforward version, favored by the Greek historian Appian, casts Spartacus as a patriot and a lifelong enemy of Rome. In this narrative, he was a free-born Thracian, possibly of noble lineage, who fought against the Roman legions as they advanced into his homeland. He may have been a tribal chieftain or a respected warrior, leading his men in defense of their ancestral lands. During one of these brutal campaigns, he was defeated, captured on the battlefield, and, like so many thousands of his countrymen, was sold into slavery. This version paints a picture of a man whose hatred for Rome was simple, pure, and deeply personal. He fought them as a free man, lost, and was subjected to the ultimate humiliation. His rebellion, in this light, was not just a fight for freedom, but a continuation of the war he had already lost once before. The Roman historian Plutarch, while agreeing that he was a Thracian captured in war, adds a crucial layer to this portrait. He writes that Spartacus was a man not only of high spirit and great courage, but in understanding and gentleness superior to his condition, and more like a Greek than a Thracian. This is remarkable praise coming from a Roman writing about his nation's greatest enemy. Plutarch suggests that Spartacus was not just a brute warrior, but a man of intellect and compassion, a natural leader whose noble character shone through even in the degradation of slavery. A second, and perhaps more compelling, version of his past is offered by the historian Florus. He claims that Spartacus had once been a Roman auxiliary soldier. This narrative is far more complex and intriguing. It suggests that at some point in his life, Spartacus voluntarily joined the Roman army, taking their pay and fighting under their standards. As an auxiliary, he would have received Roman military training. He would have learned their tactics, their discipline, their methods of building fortified camps, and their logistical strategies. He would have seen firsthand both the overwhelming strengths and the hidden weaknesses of the legions. For reasons history does not record, he then deserted the army. Perhaps he grew disgusted with Rome's brutal methods, or perhaps there was a dispute over pay or a conflict with a commander. After deserting, he became what the Romans would call a bandit, though in his own eyes, he may have been a freedom fighter, and was eventually captured. If this version is true, his punishment would have been twofold. For the crime of desertion, a soldier could expect a brutal death. By condemning him to the gladiator school instead, the Romans may have seen a chance to profit from his formidable skills. This narrative makes his later success as a general far more understandable. He wasn't just a brave Thracian warrior. He was a trained military professional who knew his enemy from the inside out. His rebellion then becomes the story of a soldier betrayed, using his master's own training to tear down his house. A third version is a variation of the second, suggesting he was a mercenary, not a formal auxiliary, who fought for and then against Rome before his capture. All three stories, however different in their details, converge on three essential facts that define the man. First, he was born free and knew what it meant to live without a master. Second, he was a man with significant military experience. And third, his freedom was violently stolen from him, creating a deep well of resentment. He was not a man broken by slavery. He was a warrior temporarily caged. There is one final, intimate detail about his life that survives, preserved by Plutarch. Spartacus was not alone. He had a wife, a fellow Thracian, who was captured with him and shared his fate. She was, Plutarch tells us, a prophetess of the cult of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, ecstasy, and abandon. This was a powerful, mystical religion, popular among the Thracians. It was said that this woman would fall into trances and foretell the future. As she looked upon her husband, even as he was bound for the arena, she saw not a condemned slave, but a figure of destiny. She prophesied that he was destined for a great and terrible future. In the bleak and hopeless world of a gladiator school, surrounded by death and despair, these words from his wife must have been a constant flame in his heart. It was a promise that his story was not over, that the chains he wore were not his final fate, and that his name was destined to be remembered not as a slave, but as a legend. His journey into the heart of the Roman beast, to the gladiatorial school in the city of Capua, was about to begin. The journey south from the rugged mountains of Thrace to the heart of Italy was itself a kind of death. Spartacus and the thousands of others shackled alongside him in the long, shuffling column known as a slave coffle were no longer people. They were cargo. They were marched under the relentless sun, choked by the dust kicked up by the guards' horses, their world shrinking to the clanking of chains and the weary groans of the men and women around them. The man who had once measured his world by the flight of an eagle now saw it through the narrow gap between the shoulders of the man chained in front of him. Every sunrise was a promise of more pain, and every sunset a brief, fitful respite before the misery began anew. This was the first stage of the Roman process of breaking a man: dehumanization. His name, if the Romans even bothered to learn it, was irrelevant. His past as a warrior, a leader, or a husband was erased. He was now a number on a ledger, a capital investment to be moved from one location to another. He would have watched as the weak faltered and were left to die on the roadside, their bodies left for the carrion birds. He would have seen the defiant ones beaten into submission or killed as an example to the others. Survival in this new world required a different kind of strength. The wild, reckless fury of a Thracian warrior was useless here. It was a path to a quick death. Survival demanded a deep, cold patience, an ability to observe, to endure, and to bury one's true self so deep that the masters could never find it. We can only imagine the psychological torment that raged within him. This was a man born and raised in the open wilderness, a man whose spirit was tied to the mountains and the forests. Now he was bound in iron, his every move dictated by another. He, who had lived by a code of honor where a man's worth was proven in battle, was now being prodded and inspected like an animal. He had been reduced to the status of an instrumentum vocale, a talking tool. What does that do to the mind of a proud warrior? It must have felt like a constant, burning fever of humiliation. The world around him had not changed. The sky was the same blue, the sun just as warm, but his place in it had been fundamentally and violently altered. He was an object in a world of subjects. During this agonizing journey, and later in the holding pens of the slave markets, Spartacus was no doubt studying his captors. He would have seen the casual cruelty of the guards, the bored indifference of the slave traders, the arrogance of the wealthy Romans who came to purchase human lives. He was learning a new and bitter lesson about his enemy. He was seeing the rot at the heart of their power, not their strength on the battlefield, which he already knew, but their moral weakness, their utter dependence on the suffering of others. He was seeing the system not from the outside as a soldier, but from the very bottom as its victim. Every lash of the whip, every sneer, every moment of degradation was being filed away, feeding a hatred far colder and more profound than the hot rage of battle. In this abyss of despair, what could possibly keep a man from shattering completely? For Spartacus, it may have been the memory of his wife. Her prophecy, her vision of his great and terrible future, was more than just a comforting word. It was an anchor. It was a framework that could give meaning to his otherwise meaningless suffering. In the darkest moments, when the desire to simply give up must have been overwhelming, her voice may have been a whisper in his mind. This was not the end. This humiliation, this agony, was a necessary trial, a crucible he had to pass through to reach the destiny she had foreseen. His chains were not a symbol of his final defeat, but a temporary burden on the path to something greater. This belief, whether born of faith in her vision or his own indomitable will to survive, would have been the key to his psychological transformation. The hot, impulsive anger of the captured warrior cooled into the cold, patient resolve of a survivor. He learned to wear the mask of submission, to show his masters the broken, compliant slave they wanted to see. But behind the mask, the mind of the general was still working, observing, calculating. He arrived at the gates of Capua no longer just a Thracian warrior, but something far more dangerous. A man who had seen the very worst of the Roman world and had decided, with every fiber of his being, that he would survive it. He would endure, he would learn, and he would wait for his moment. He did not yet know how, but he knew that his war with Rome was not over. It was only just beginning. Capua was one of the richest and most luxurious cities in all of Italy, second only to Rome itself. It was a city of sprawling villas, famous for its fine bronzes, its rich perfumes, and its decadent pleasures. But beneath this veneer of high culture, Capua was the undisputed capital of a far darker trade. It was the center of the gladiatorial business, home to the most famous training schools, or ludi, in the Republic. It was here, at the gates of a school owned by a man named Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus, that Spartacus's journey into the abyss truly began. A ludus was a hybrid institution, half military academy, half maximum security prison. It was a business, and a highly profitable one, run by a man known as a lanista. The lanista was a peculiar figure in Roman society. He was often wealthy and influential, yet his profession was considered vile and dishonorable. The Roman elite looked down on him as a merchant of death, a panderer to the bloodlust of the masses. But they needed him. Lentulus Batiatus was one such man, a shrewd businessman who purchased human raw material, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and unruly slaves, with the goal of transforming them into polished killing machines for the arena. For a new arrival like Spartacus, the first impression of the ludus would have been overwhelming. The air itself was thick with the smells of sweat, fear, and blood, and the sounds were a constant jarring symphony. The rhythmic clang of steel on steel from the training yard, the sharp commands of the trainers, the grunts of exertion, and the occasional scream of pain. The new recruits, known as novitiae, were stripped of the last vestiges of their former identity. Their past was gone, their future was the arena, and their present was a grueling, monotonous cycle of pain and conditioning. The daily routine was brutal and designed to break the will. The day began before dawn, with a meager but high-energy meal, typically a gritty barley porridge designed to build muscle and a layer of fat, which could offer some protection from superficial cuts in the arena. Then came the training, which lasted all day, every day. Under the watchful eyes of trainers or doctors, often former gladiators themselves who had survived long enough to retire, the recruits were drilled relentlessly. They began with basic fitness, spending endless hours running, jumping, and lifting heavy weights to build the necessary strength and stamina. Then they moved to weapons training. Initially, they used heavy wooden swords called rudes, which were often twice the weight of their steel counterparts. The idea was that if a man could fight all day with a heavy wooden sword, a real one would feel as light as a feather in his hand. They were taught the specific skills of the gladiatorial type they were assigned to become: a Thracian, a Samnite, a Murmillo. Each had its own unique combination of armor and weaponry, its own set of moves and countermoves. This was not the chaotic brawling of a battlefield. It was a highly formalized and deadly martial art. Discipline within the ludus was absolute and enforced with immediate, savage cruelty. The primary tool of motivation was the whip. Any sign of insubordination, any hesitation in training, was met with a swift lashing. The trainers and guards roamed the yard, their presence a constant, intimidating reminder of who was in control. For serious offenses, the punishments were far worse, ranging from solitary confinement in a dark cell to torture. A gladiator's life belonged entirely to his lanista. And yet, in a strange paradox, one aspect of a gladiator's life was of the highest quality: his medical care. A gladiator was a prized asset, a significant financial investment. A lanista like Batiatus would not let his investment die from a preventable infection or a poorly healed injury. The schools employed skilled doctors who were experts in treating trauma wounds. They patched up the gladiators after brutal training sessions, set broken bones, and stitched gaping cuts. This was not an act of compassion. It was sound business practice. They were keeping the product in fighting condition. Spartacus, the trained soldier, would have observed this entire system with a calculating eye. He would have endured the brutal training, his body growing stronger even as his spirit raged against his captivity. But unlike many of the other prisoners, he would have seen more than just a prison. He would have seen a military structure. He saw the strict routine, the rigorous training, the clear chain of command. He saw men from a dozen different tribes, Gauls, Germans, Syrians, being stripped of their old identities and forged into a single cohesive community of fighters. They were being taught to kill, to obey, and to have no fear of death. Lentulus Batiatus thought he was creating entertainers for the bloody sand of the arena. He had no idea that he was unintentionally training the officer corps for a revolutionary army. Rome was sharpening the very sword that would soon be pointed at its own throat. The men Spartacus trained alongside were a strange and disparate collection of humanity, a microcosm of the Roman Empire's conquered peoples, all brought together by violence. They were not a uniform group. While many were prisoners of war like himself, Thracians, Gauls, Germans, men who carried the memory of freedom in their hearts, others had followed a different path to the arena. Some were noxiae, condemned criminals sentenced to die in the ludus as a form of capital punishment. For them, every day of training was merely a postponement of an inevitable violent death. Their despair was of a different, more profound kind, for they had no past glory to cling to, only a future of certain doom. Even more perplexing were the Octorati, free men who had voluntarily sworn the gladiator's oath, the Sacramentum Gladiatorium. Driven by crushing debt, social ruin, or a desperate thirst for fame, these men sold their freedom for a contract with the lanista. By signing, they legally became slaves for the duration of their contract, swearing an oath to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. They were social outcasts who sought a final, spectacular gamble, hoping to win fame and fortune on the sand of the arena. This mix of proud warriors, condemned criminals, and desperate citizens created a volatile, multilingual, and deeply fractured community within the walls of the ludus. To be a gladiator in Roman society was to live a paradox. In the eyes of the law, they were infames, the lowest of the low, stripped of all civil rights and considered socially dead. They were on par with prostitutes and actors, seen as objects for public use, not as citizens. And yet, in the eyes of the adoring public, the most successful gladiators were superstars. They were the celebrity athletes of their day. Their images were scratched onto walls as graffiti, Their names were whispered by aristocratic women who paid fortunes to spend a night with them, and children played with clay figurines of their favorite champions. They were simultaneously despised and idolized, dead in the eyes of the law but intensely alive in the imagination of the mob. This strange duality was reflected in the very structure of their lives. Inside the ludus, they were trained to fight and die in highly specific, ritualized ways. A gladiator was not just a generic fighter. He belonged to a specific class or type, each with its own traditional equipment and fighting style. A retiarius or netman fought with a weighted net, a trident, and a dagger, relying on speed and agility. He was often pitted against the heavily armed secutor. A murmillo wore a massive helmet with a fish crest and carried a large rectangular shield. Spartacus, being a Thracian, was likely trained as a Thraex. This class of gladiator was equipped in the style of his homeland, with a small, square shield and the signature curved Sicca sword. It was a cruel irony. The Romans forced him to perform a caricature of his own warrior culture for their entertainment. How could such a divided group of men, trained to kill each other for sport, ever unite? The answer lay in the shared crucible of their existence. The brutal, daily training forged a bond that transcended language and origin. They saw each other sweat, they bandaged each other's wounds, and they knew that the man sparring with them today might be the man ordered to kill them tomorrow. This constant intimacy with death created a unique warrior code. They were rivals, but they were also the only ones who truly understood the reality of their lives. They formed burial clubs, pooling their meager earnings to ensure that a fallen comrade would receive a proper funeral and a tombstone, often inscribed with his record and a message of respect. Spartacus, with his innate intelligence and leadership qualities noted by Plutarch, would have navigated this complex world with care. He was not just another fighter. He would have been an observer, a man who could see the bigger picture. He saw the shared anger that simmered beneath the surface, the common enemy in the form of Batiatus and the entire Roman system. The others would have seen his superior skill, not just with a sword, but in his ability to command respect. In a place filled with broken and desperate men, a figure of quiet strength and dignity would have been a natural focal point. He was learning not only how to survive but how to lead. The ludus was meant to be a machine that turned men into beasts. But for some, it became a furnace that forged a brotherhood of the doomed that was slowly, unknowingly, becoming ready for a leader. The ludus of Lentulus Batiatus was a pressure cooker, and the lid was about to blow off. The bonds of the Brotherhood of the Doomed had solidified. A shared language of quiet desperation and mutual respect had formed among the fighters. And at the center of this simmering discontent stood Spartacus. His leadership was not loud or boastful. It was earned through his skill in the training yard and the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. The men, particularly the proud Gauls and Germans, saw in him a reflection of their own lost warrior status. The final spark, according to the ancient sources, was a matter of business. Batiatus was holding a large number of his best gladiators, mostly Gauls and Germans, in close confinement. He was reserving them for a specific high-profile event in Capua and was reluctant to risk them in smaller contests. For the gladiators, this meant an even more restrictive form of imprisonment, with no outlet for their skills and no chance to win prize money or fleeting glory. They felt less like prized fighters and more like fattened cattle waiting for the slaughter. This final indignity was too much to bear. A conspiracy was born. The initial plan was ambitious. Around 200 gladiators secretly pledged an oath to fight for their freedom. Their plan was to overwhelm the guards in a coordinated assault and break out of the ludus en masse. They began to gather what makeshift weapons they could and coordinate their movements. But a prison, especially one filled with men trained to be mistrustful, is a difficult place to keep a secret. As is so often the case in such desperate ventures, there was a betrayal. Someone, either hoping for a reward or simply broken by fear, revealed the plot to the authorities. The plan was exposed. Gladiator and his guards were alerted. The element of surprise was lost. For the 200 conspirators, it seemed that all was lost. They faced certain punishment, torture, and a particularly gruesome death in the arena as a warning to all others. In that moment of crisis, as the guards prepared to round them up, Spartacus and his closest followers made a decision born of pure desperation. If their grand plan had failed, they would not wait passively for their doom. They would choose to die fighting on their own terms, right here and now. A small, core group of the conspirators, numbering around 78 men, decided to act immediately. With no time to retrieve hidden weapons, they needed something, anything, to fight with. Their eyes fell upon the one place in the ludus that was not designed for combat: the kitchen. They stormed the cookhouse, seizing the tools of the servants' trade. They armed themselves with whatever came to hand: long, heavy meat cleavers, sharp carving knives, and iron cooking spits, perfect for stabbing and thrusting. Armed with this bizarre and brutal arsenal, they burst out into the training yard. The guards, though alerted to the plot, were caught completely off guard by the sudden suicidal ferocity of the attack. They expected to be rounding up subdued prisoners, not facing a whirlwind of steel wielded by the most dangerous fighters in the world. The gladiators, with Spartacus and his key lieutenants, the powerful Gauls Crixus and Enemaus, at the forefront, cut a bloody path through the astonished guards. Years of training, of learning to kill with ruthless efficiency, were unleashed not for the entertainment of a crowd, but for the raw, exhilarating purpose of survival. They fought their way through the corridors of their prison, tasting a freedom that was measured in inches and seconds. Bursting out of the ludus and onto the streets of Capua, they were a terrifying sight to the city's inhabitants. A mob of half-naked, blood-splattered men, their bodies scarred from 100 training wounds, brandishing kitchen implements and roaring with the fury of caged animals set loose. But their luck had not run out. In what must have seemed like a sign from the gods, they stumbled upon a wagon that was transporting a shipment of gladiatorial weapons and armor to another school in the city. It was a fateful encounter. They quickly overpowered the wagon's drivers, throwing aside their crude kitchen tools and equipping themselves with the tools of their trade: real swords, shields, helmets, and tridents. In an instant, they were transformed. They were no longer a desperate rabble of escaped slaves. They were now a small but heavily armed and highly skilled professional fighting force. They fought their way through the hastily assembled city militia that tried to stop them, their superior skill and reckless courage scattering the panicked defenders. They smashed through the city gates and finally left Capua behind them, the shouts and chaos of the city fading into the distance. They had done the impossible. They were free. But it was a fragile, precarious freedom. They were a tiny band of fugitives in the heart of enemy territory, with the entire might of the Roman Republic about to turn its malevolent gaze upon them. They needed a sanctuary, a defensible position to regroup and decide what to do next. Their eyes turned to the brooding, silent mountain that loomed over the entire region, the great volcano Vesuvius. Free but hunted. This was the reality for the small band of gladiators as they made their way across the fertile plains of Campania. Behind them lay the prison of Capua. Before them lay the entire Roman Republic. They were a tiny island of defiance in an ocean of Roman power. Every road was a potential trap, every town a hostile fortress. They could not keep running forever. They needed a base, a stronghold where they could catch their breath, tend to their wounded, and forge a plan. Their choice was both desperate and brilliant. They climbed the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. In the 1st century BC, Vesuvius was not the active, menacing volcano known to history. Its last major eruption had been centuries before, and its slopes were green and fertile, covered in dense wild forests and tangled vines that produced some of the region's best wine. To the wealthy Romans who built their luxurious summer villas at its base, it was a beautiful dormant giant. But for Spartacus, the mountain offered something far more valuable than scenic beauty. It was a natural fortress. The summit of Vesuvius was a large, bowl-shaped crater, a kind of natural amphitheater. The walls of this crater were steep and rocky, and according to the geographer Strabo, there was only one path to the top, a narrow, treacherous track that was easily defended. By seizing this single point of access, a small number of determined fighters could hold off a much larger force indefinitely. The forested slopes provided cover from prying eyes, a supply of wood for fires and fortifications, and a source of wild game. The wild vines that grew in abundance would soon prove to be their most crucial resource. Vesuvius was the perfect lair for a fledgling rebellion. It was here, amidst the rugged rocks and windswept trees of the summit, that the escaped gladiators formalized their command structure. They were no longer just a desperate mob. They were an army, and an army needed generals. By common consent, they elected 3 leaders. First among them was the Thracian, Spartacus, the acknowledged mastermind of the escape and the man whose intellect and strategic thinking had already saved them. Alongside him were the 2 Gauls who had been instrumental in the breakout, Crixus and Enemouse. Crixus was a man forged from pure warrior instinct. He was immensely powerful, courageous to the point of recklessness, and fueled by a burning hatred for the Romans. While Spartacus was the mind of the rebellion, Crixus was its heart, embodying the raw fury of the oppressed. Enemouse is a more shadowy figure in the historical accounts, but he was clearly a respected and capable warrior, trusted enough to be elevated to the highest command alongside the other 2. This triumvirate of a Thracian strategist and 2 Gaulish warriors reflected the mixed nature of their small army and provided a leadership that could appeal to the different nationalities within their ranks. With their fortress secured and their leadership established, their first priority was survival. They needed food, better equipment, and most importantly, more men. From their mountain stronghold, they began to conduct lightning raids on the surrounding countryside. They descended from the slopes like wolves upon the flock, targeting the opulent villas and large farmsteads that dotted the landscape at the foot of Vesuvius. These raids served multiple purposes. They provided the rebels with a steady supply of food and wine. They allowed them to exchange their gladiatorial armor, which was showy and impractical for real warfare, for the simpler, more effective equipment of the Roman soldiers who guarded the estates. But most crucially, with every successful raid, they liberated the slaves they found toiling on these properties. The news of their success began to spread, carried by whispered rumors from one plantation to the next. A band of gladiators had escaped, killed their masters, and established a free community on the mountain. For the thousands of slaves living in abject misery across Campania, this was not just news. It was a call to arms. A flicker of hope had been ignited in the heart of the Roman beast. The small band of 78 was about to become an army. Word of the breakout in Capua, and the subsequent establishment of a rebel camp on Vesuvius, eventually reached the marble-floored Curia in Rome. The initial reports, likely delivered by panicked landowners from Campania, were met not with alarm, but with a collective sigh of aristocratic irritation. To the powerful men who governed the known world, this was a distraction, a distasteful piece of domestic administration, not a matter of state. Their minds and the Republic's resources were focused on what they considered to be real wars, struggles worthy of their attention. Far away in Spain, the brilliant and rebellious general Quintus Sertorius was leading a full-scale secession, a rogue Roman government that had tied down Rome's best legions for nearly a decade. In the east, the formidable King Mithridates of Pontus, a master of poisons and politics, was a persistent and dangerous threat, constantly probing the edges of Roman territory and requiring a massive military commitment to keep him in check. Compared to these grand geopolitical struggles, a small uprising of slaves and gladiators, no matter how violent, seemed like a triviality. The senators did not dignify the event with the term bellum, or war. That was a word reserved for conflicts against legitimate states and honorable enemies. What was happening on the slopes of Vesuvius was merely latrocinium, robbery, banditry on a large scale. They saw Spartacus and his followers not as a revolutionary army, but as a gang of dangerous criminals who had gotten lucky. It was a problem for law enforcement, not the military. This fatal categorization, born of centuries of ingrained cultural and social superiority, would be the foundation of Rome's first and most catastrophic miscalculation. The masters of the world simply could not conceive that their talking tools could ever pose a genuine threat. The responsibility for quelling this banditry was therefore delegated down the chain of command. It was not a task for a prestigious consul, the highest office in the Republic. Instead, it fell to a mid-ranking magistrate, a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber. History has preserved almost nothing about this man, save for his spectacular failure. He was likely a typical product of the Roman political ladder, an ambitious man from a respectable, but not elite, family, eager to prove his competence and climb higher. A quick, clean victory against a band of runaway slaves would be a small but useful credit on his public record, a stepping stone to more important commands. He was given no legions. The hardened, professional soldiers of the Republic were far too valuable to be wasted on such a menial task. Instead, Glaber was authorized to levy a militia force, numbering around 3,000 men. This was not a Roman army in any meaningful sense. It was a hastily assembled posse of raw recruits, many of whom were likely pulled from the city's lower classes, given a shield, a short sword, and minimal training. They were not bound by the legionary's oath or hardened by years of campaigning. They lacked discipline, experience, and the unshakable unit cohesion that made the legions so formidable. But against a group that had started with fewer than 80 men, 3,000 seemed like an insurmountable advantage. No one in Rome, and certainly not Glaber himself, harbored the slightest doubt that the campaign would be over in a matter of weeks, if not days. Glaber marched his militia south, his mind likely filled with visions of a swift and bloodless victory. He would return to Rome a minor hero, the man who efficiently cleaned up a mess. When he arrived at the base of Vesuvius and his scouts surveyed the terrain, his initial confidence swelled into absolute certainty. The reports confirmed that the rebels were indeed camped within the crater at the summit. Crucially, there was only one known track that led up the mountain. The other sides of the crater were sheer vertical cliffs of crumbling volcanic rock, considered utterly impassable for any organized group of men. The rebels, it seemed, had cornered themselves. The tactical solution was so obvious it barely required thought. Why risk his men in a bloody uphill assault against desperate gladiators defending a narrow path? Such a move would be costly, undignified, and unnecessary. Glaber chose the path of arrogant simplicity. He would not attack them. He would simply besiege them. He ordered his men to make camp directly at the mouth of the single path, sealing it completely. His troops established a fortified line, cutting off the rebels' only route of escape and their only means of gathering supplies from the lowlands. The plan was as elegant as it was contemptuous. He had locked them in a mountain prison and thrown away the key. Now all he had to do was wait. Hunger and thirst would be his generals. They would break the rebel spirit far more effectively than any sword. Glaber settled into his command tent, confident in his strategy, and waited for the inevitable surrender. He had failed to consider that he was not besieging common bandits. He was besieging a military genius who thrived on the impossible. Inside the crater atop Vesuvius, the mood was growing grim. The initial euphoria of freedom had evaporated, replaced by the gnawing anxiety of a slow creeping death. Glaber's blockade was brutally effective. The rebels were prisoners once more, their cell now a windswept mountain peak instead of a stone-walled ludus. Their supplies of food and water, scavenged during their initial raids, were dwindling with alarming speed. The men, warriors all, could face any enemy in open combat, but this was a different kind of foe. They were being besieged by hunger, a silent, relentless enemy that could not be fought with a sword. Despair began to creep into the camp like a cold mountain fog. They had escaped the arena only to die of starvation, trapped between a Roman army and an impassable cliff. It was in this moment of mounting desperation that Spartacus proved he was more than just a courageous fighter. He was a visionary. While his men saw only their predicament, he saw the landscape. He spent his days studying their prison, his gaze fixed not on the Roman camp below, but on the sheer vertical cliffs that the Romans had dismissed as impassable. He observed the way the light fell on the rock face, the patterns of the fissures, and, most importantly, the vegetation. The slopes of Vesuvius were covered in a thick, wild species of grapevine. These vines, ancient and tough, clung to the rock, their powerful tendrils digging into every crack and crevice, stretching in long rope-like strands down the cliff face. To the Romans, they were just part of the scenery. To Spartacus, they were the key. An idea, audacious and seemingly insane, began to form in his mind. He gathered his lieutenants, Crixus and Enemaus, and shared his plan. They would not go down the path the Romans were guarding. They would go down the cliff. He ordered his men to harvest the longest and strongest of the wild vines. Working quickly and quietly, they began to weave them together, plaiting and knotting the tough tendrils to create thick, sturdy ropes. From these ropes, they fashioned crude but strong ladders, long enough to reach the base of the steepest section of the cliff. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity and breathtaking in its risk. They would descend the impassable rock face under the cover of night and take the Roman army by complete surprise. The execution of the plan required every ounce of the gladiators' strength, discipline, and nerve. As darkness fell, a storm rolled in, its winds and shadows providing the perfect cover for their desperate gamble. One by one, in absolute silence, the men began their descent. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were men whose bodies were honed to physical perfection, whose sense of balance and grip had been sharpened by years of life-or-death training. But even for them, the ordeal was harrowing. Clinging to the rough, swaying vine ladders, with a black abyss yawning beneath them, they made their way down. The wind tore at them, and loose scree clattered into the darkness below, each sound a thunderclap in the tense silence. A single mistake, a single cry of alarm, would bring the entire Roman force upon them and doom them all. But the Romans below heard nothing. Glaber's militia, utterly convinced of their strategic superiority, had grown complacent. Their camp was poorly fortified, their sentries lax. Why would they keep a vigilant watch on a sheer cliff when the only threat was starving men trapped far above them? The soldiers slept soundly in their tents, confident that the campaign was all but over. They had no idea that death was, at that very moment, descending upon them from the sky. After what must have felt like an eternity, Spartacus and his men reached the base of the cliff undetected. They had accomplished the impossible. They were no longer trapped on the mountain. They were now a silent, deadly force positioned in the rear of a sleeping and unsuspecting enemy. Spartacus quickly organized his fighters. They crept around the base of the mountain, their bare feet making little sound on the soft earth, until they stood at the edge of the Roman camp. At his signal, they unleashed hell. They burst into the camp like vengeful ghosts, their battle cries mixing with the howl of the wind. The attack was a complete and utter shock. Roman militiamen, startled from a deep sleep, stumbled out of their tents confused and half-dressed, grabbing for weapons they could not find in the dark. There was no time to form a battle line, no time to listen for a commander's orders. The gladiators were among them, a whirlwind of steel and fury, their blades finding throats and hearts in the chaotic darkness. The slaughter was swift and brutal. Panic replaced discipline, and the Roman force dissolved into a terrified mob of individuals, each man running for his own life. The battle, such as it was was over in minutes. Glaber himself, in a final act of humiliation, was forced to flee, abandoning his camp, his equipment, and his dignity. As the sun rose, it revealed the scale of Spartacus's victory. The Roman camp was theirs. The threat of starvation was gone, replaced by an abundance of captured Roman supplies. But far more importantly, they now had a massive cache of real military equipment. They threw away their remaining gladiatorial gear and armed themselves as a proper army, with Roman swords, helmets, shields, and armor. And more valuable than any weapon, they had won a legend. The story of the miracle on Vesuvius would spread like wildfire. A small band of slaves had not just defeated a Roman army. They had outsmarted it, humiliated it, and vanished its commander. Spartacus was no longer just a rebel. He was a hero, and his army was about to grow. The victory over Glaber was more than just a military triumph. It was a profound psychological turning point. On the slopes of Vesuvius, the rebels had not merely survived. They had dominated. They had faced a Roman force, the embodiment of the power that had enslaved them, and had utterly humiliated it. This single event transformed their self-perception. They were no longer a desperate band of fugitives, fighting only for their next meal. They were now a victorious army, led by a commander who seemed capable of achieving the impossible. The legend of Spartacus was born in the pre-dawn chaos of that shattered Roman camp, and news of it began to spread like a contagion of hope across the plantations and pastures of Campania. The first to answer the call were the ones who had the least to lose and the most to gain. From the great latifundia that surrounded Vesuvius, slaves began to slip away in the dead of night, risking a brutal death for a chance at freedom. They came armed with sickles, flails, and a burning hatred for their masters. But it wasn't just escaped slaves who flocked to Spartacus's banner. He was joined by the rural poor, the dispossessed of Roman society. Herdsmen from the mountains, tough, independent men who knew the land intimately, joined his cause. So too did runaway farmhands and impoverished free peasants who had been squeezed off their land by the slave-powered megafarms. His camp on Vesuvius swelled, growing from a few hundred to several thousand, and then to tens of thousands. It was no longer a war camp. It was a mobile city of the oppressed, a chaotic, multilingual mass of men, women, and children, all united by a common enemy. This sudden, massive influx of recruits presented Spartacus with a monumental challenge, one that would have crushed a lesser man. He was now the leader of a vast, undisciplined mob. They were passionate and brave, but they were not soldiers. They spoke dozens of different languages and worshipped different gods. They were Gauls, Germans, Thracians, Syrians, and native Italians, each with their own cultural pride and ancient rivalries. How could he possibly forge this disparate collection of humanity into a cohesive fighting force capable of standing against the disciplined legions of Rome? His first task was training. Spartacus and his corps of experienced gladiators became the drill sergeants of this new army. They established a rigorous training regimen on the slopes of Vesuvius. Using the captured Roman equipment, they taught the former slaves the basics of military discipline. Men who had only ever wielded a hoe were taught how to hold a sword, how to form a shield wall, how to march in formation, and most importantly, how to obey commands in the heat of battle. Spartacus understood the Roman way of war. He knew that individual bravery was useless against the methodical, collective power of the legion. He had to teach his men to fight not as a mob, but as a single, disciplined body. The second task was armament. While the victory over Glaber had provided them with an initial supply of weapons, it was not nearly enough for an army of thousands. So Spartacus turned his camp into a massive makeshift weapons factory. He put the blacksmiths and metalworkers among his recruits to work, establishing forges that glowed day and night. They melted down farming tools, iron fences, and captured scrap metal, hammering it into crude but effective swords, spearheads, and shields. It was a testament to their ingenuity and desperation, an army arming itself with the very chains and tools of its former oppression. But Spartacus's true genius as a leader was not just military. It was social and political. He understood that an army built on plunder and greed would quickly devour itself from within. Early on, he instituted a rule that was as radical as it was brilliant. All captured spoils were to be collected and distributed equally among everyone. There would be no private looting. Furthermore, according to the historian Plutarch, he forbade any man in his army from possessing gold or silver. This was a masterstroke of leadership. It eliminated a major source of potential conflict and jealousy. It sent a clear message that their war was not about personal enrichment. It was a united struggle for a common cause, freedom. This policy elevated the rebellion from a mere bandit enterprise to a genuine social movement with a powerful moral foundation. It fostered a sense of community and shared purpose that was essential for maintaining discipline and morale. Under his command, the chaotic mob was slowly, painstakingly, being forged into a real army. They were learning, growing stronger, and becoming more organized with each passing day. The Roman Senate, still viewing the situation as a minor annoyance, had yet to grasp the true nature of the threat they now faced. They believed they were dealing with a cornered animal. They were about to discover they had created a dragon. Spartacus's army was ready to descend from the mountain, not just to raid, but to conquer. With the Roman militia scattered and a legend forged in fire and shadow, the army of Spartacus descended from Vesuvius. They were no longer a band of fugitives clinging to a mountaintop. They were a force of nature, a rolling earthquake of revolution moving across the plains of Campania. Their objective was no longer mere survival. It was liberation. As they marched, they became a magnet for the hopeless. The news of their victory, carried on the wind and in the hushed whispers of slaves, preceded them. When the rebel army appeared on the horizon, the slaves toiling in the fields and vineyards did not run in fear. They dropped their tools, broke their chains, and ran to join them. The rebellion was now a self-fueling fire, and every estate it touched provided more fuel for the flames. The Senate in Rome, shocked out of its complacency by the humiliating defeat of Glaber, finally began to grasp that this was more than simple banditry. The situation required a more serious response. They dispatched another praetor, Publius Varinius, this time with a larger, more professional force. Varinius was a more experienced commander than Glaber, and he arrived in Campania with a clear strategy: to use his superior numbers to surround and crush the rebels. He divided his army into several detachments under the command of his legates, or junior officers, intending to pin Spartacus's army between them in a classic Roman pincer movement. It was a sound textbook strategy. But Spartacus was not a textbook general. He refused to be drawn into a conventional battle where the Roman superior discipline might prevail. He understood that his army's greatest strengths were speed, surprise, and a burning motivation that the Roman soldiers lacked. Instead of waiting to be trapped, he went on the offensive, using his knowledge of the local terrain to outmaneuver the Romans at every turn. He became a ghost, his army appearing where it was least expected, striking hard, and then vanishing back into the countryside before the Romans could mount an effective response. He targeted Varinius's subordinates first, determined to dismantle the Roman strategy piece by piece. His first victim was Varinius's legate, Lucius Furius, who commanded a detachment of 2,000 men. Spartacus fell upon Furius's force with such speed and ferocity that the Roman line broke almost immediately, turning the battle into a rout. With one arm of Varinius's pincer now amputated, Spartacus turned his attention to the other. Another legate, Lucius Cassinius, was dispatched with a significant force to track him down. What happened next is a testament to both Spartacus's audacity and the lingering arrogance of the Romans. Plutarch tells a vivid story of the encounter. Spartacus and his scouts located Cassinius's camp near a villa where the Roman commander had stopped for a bath. While the praetor was relaxing, completely unaware of the danger, Spartacus launched a surprise attack. Cassinius barely escaped with his life, forced to flee naked and humiliated from his bath while the rebels overran his camp, capturing all of his baggage and supplies. Emboldened by this success, Spartacus pursued the fleeing Roman force relentlessly, finally catching and crushing it in a brutal battle. Cassinius himself was killed in the fighting. Praetor Varinius was now in an impossible position. His strategy was in ruins, his subordinates were defeated or dead, and his own demoralized army was being constantly harassed and outmaneuvered. Spartacus, sensing the moment of ultimate victory, finally turned on Varinius's main force. In a climactic battle, the rebel army, now battle-hardened and supremely confident, smashed the praetor's legions. The victory was total. Varinius, like Glaber before him, was forced to flee in disgrace. But this time, the rebels captured a greater prize than just weapons. They captured Varinius's own horse and, most symbolically, his lictors with their fasces, the ceremonial bundles of rods and an axe that represented a Roman magistrate's power to command and punish. By seizing the fasces, Spartacus had, in effect, stripped a Roman praetor of his authority. A slave had captured the very symbols of Roman power. This final, stunning victory sealed his control over southern Italy. The chain reaction was complete. The army, which now numbered, according to some sources, as many as 70,000 men, was unstoppable. They captured towns like Nuceria and Metapontum, sacking them for supplies and establishing safe winter quarters. The once desperate band of fugitives had become the de facto rulers of a large swath of Roman territory. As the harsh Italian winter of 73 BC set in, Spartacus had time to rest his men, consolidate his power, and ponder his next move. He was no longer a rebel. He was a conqueror. But with this great success came even greater problems: how to feed and control a nation on the move, and how to manage the pride and ambition of the very men who had helped him achieve the impossible. The winter of 73 BC provided a much-needed respite from the constant fighting, but it brought with it a new set of challenges that were, in their own way, as daunting as any Roman legion. Spartacus's success had become his greatest logistical nightmare. His army was no longer a lean, mobile force of several thousand warriors. It had swelled into a vast, sprawling society on the move, a veritable nation of the dispossessed. Estimates of its size vary wildly, with some ancient sources claiming it reached over 100,000 people. This number included not just the fighting men, but thousands of women, children, and elderly dependents who had been liberated from the estates or had joined the cause. They were a chaotic, hopeful, and desperately hungry nation, and Spartacus was now not just their general, but their provider, their lawgiver, and their king in all but name. The most pressing and relentless problem was food. A fighting man needs thousands of calories a day to remain effective, and Spartacus had tens of thousands of them under his command, plus a massive civilian population. The army could no longer sustain itself through simple, opportunistic raids. Feeding 100,000 people required a systematic and highly organized effort. Spartacus transformed his army into a giant foraging machine. He sent out large, disciplined detachments with specific missions: to locate and seize the granaries of large estates, to round up herds of cattle and sheep, and to strip the countryside of its stores of wine, olive oil, and grain. These were not chaotic looting parties. They were planned logistical operations, essential for the survival of their new nation. This constant need for sustenance dictated the army's movements. They could not stay in one place for long, as they would quickly consume every available resource like a swarm of locusts, creating a barren wasteland around them. They had to keep moving, shifting their winter quarters from one captured town to another, always seeking new territories to supply their needs. This nomadic existence was a strategic necessity, keeping the Romans off balance, but it was also a burden, especially for the women and children who had to endure the hardships of constant travel in the cold and wet Italian winter. Beyond food, there was the endless demand for weapons and equipment. An army is a machine that constantly consumes and breaks its tools. Swords chip and shatter, shields split, armor is dented, and spears are lost or broken in every skirmish. The initial cache of weapons captured from Glaber and Verinius was a start, but it was a finite resource. To keep his army effective, Spartacus had to create a mobile industrial base. The forges that had been established on Vesuvius now became a permanent, traveling feature of his camp. Every skilled artisan who joined the rebellion, every blacksmith, carpenter, leatherworker, and stonemason, was immediately put to work for the war effort. The rebel camp, wherever it settled, would transform into a hive of activity. The clang of hammers on anvils would echo day and night as blacksmiths repaired damaged swords and forged new spearheads from scrap metal. Carpenters would be busy constructing new shields and repairing wagons. Leatherworkers would be stitching harnesses, belts, and sandals. Spartacus was effectively running a mobile state, complete with its own military-industrial complex, all operating on the run and fueled by captured resources. Perhaps the most difficult challenge of all was maintaining order and unity within this diverse and volatile population. This was a society of traumatized people, many of whom were armed for the first time in their lives, and all of whom harbored deep reservoirs of rage. Disputes could easily turn deadly. The ancient rivalries between the different ethnic groups, the proud and boisterous Gauls, the fierce and somber Germans, the disciplined Thracians, were a constant threat to cohesion. A simple drunken brawl between a Gaul and a German could escalate into a camp-wide riot if not handled carefully. Spartacus had to be more than a general. He had to be a judge and a diplomat. He established a system of rough justice to settle disputes and punish crimes within the camp. His authority, backed by his elite guard of gladiators, was absolute. His focus on the equal distribution of spoils was a key tool in preventing internal strife, but it could not solve everything. He spent countless hours mediating conflicts between his lieutenants, balancing the proud ambitions of men like Crixus with the strategic needs of the entire army. He had to forge a common identity, a sense of belonging to the army of Spartacus, that could override their old tribal loyalties. It was a constant, exhausting balancing act. In this massive, mobile society, the thousands of women played a crucial, though often overlooked, role. They were not just passive followers. They were the logistical and social backbone of the rebellion. While the men trained and fought, the women managed the vast stores of food, cooked the communal meals, tended to the sick and wounded in makeshift infirmaries, and cared for the children. They maintained the social fabric of the camp, preserving a semblance of normal life amidst the chaos of war. Spartacus's own wife, the Thracian prophetess, likely held a position of great influence, her visions and spiritual guidance offering hope and a sense of divine purpose to the rebels. Her presence was a constant reminder that this was not just a war for survival, but a struggle for the future, for a world where their children might be born free. As the winter passed, this incredible makeshift nation, forged in fire and held together by the will of one man, prepared for the spring. And in Rome, the Senate was preparing as well, determined that this time they would send an army that could not fail. As the winter snows began to melt from the peaks of the Apennines, a critical debate raged within the command structure of the rebel army. The victories over Glaber and Verinius had given them control of southern Italy, but Spartacus knew this was a temporary state of affairs. He was a realist. He understood that Rome's initial incompetent responses were a product of arrogance, not weakness. Sooner or later, the full terrifying might of the Republic's legions would be brought to bear upon them. They were living on borrowed time, in a cage whose bars were slowly being reinforced. For Spartacus, the strategic objective had always been clear and consistent: escape. His plan, which he laid out to his commanders, was as logical as it was audacious. Come spring, he argued, They should march their entire force north, up the spine of Italy. Their goal was not to conquer Rome, an objective he knew was impossible for an army of former slaves without siege equipment or a stable supply line. Their goal was the Alps. If they could cross that formidable mountain barrier, they would be out of Italy and beyond the direct reach of Roman power. Once across, their great multi-ethnic army could finally disband. The Gauls and Germans could return to their homelands as free men. The Thracians could make their way back across the Adriatic. The war would be won, not by destroying Rome, but by simply leaving it behind. It was a pragmatic plan focused on the one thing that had united them all from the beginning: the promise of true and lasting freedom. But this vision was not shared by everyone in his command. His most powerful lieutenant, the Gaulish warrior Crixus, had a very different idea of victory. Crixus was a man of immense bravery and raw physical power, but he was not a strategist. He was driven by more primal forces: rage and revenge. He had suffered under Roman masters, and he had seen his people subjugated by Roman legions. For him, this was not just a war of liberation. It was a war of retribution. The idea of simply turning their backs and leaving Italy felt like cowardice, like running away after having finally gained the upper hand. Crixus and his large faction of followers, mostly fellow Gauls and Germans, were intoxicated by their success. They had defeated every Roman force sent against them. They had grown rich on plunder. They saw Italy not as a trap to be escaped, but as a prize to be bled dry. Why march for months to the cold, impoverished lands of the north when the sun-drenched villas and wealthy, undefended towns of Italy lay at their feet? Their vision of victory was not a quiet return to a distant home. It was the sack of Roman cities, the slaughter of their former masters, and perhaps in their wildest dreams, a march on Rome itself. They did not want to escape Rome. They wanted to punish it. This fundamental disagreement created the first serious fracture within the rebellion. It was a clash of two different worlds, two different mindsets. Spartacus was the cool-headed general, his eyes fixed on the long-term strategic goal. Crixus was the passionate warrior, his heart consumed by the immediate desire for vengeance and spoils. Spartacus saw their army as a tool for liberation. Crixus saw it as an instrument of wrath. We can imagine the heated arguments in the command tent, the Thracian strategist appealing to logic and reason, the Gaulish chieftain roaring about honor and the justice of the sword. This was not merely a personal rivalry. It was a reflection of the deep divisions within the army itself. Many of the men were, like Crixus, driven by a simple and brutal desire to inflict upon the Romans the same pain they had suffered. They had no interest in a long, arduous march across the Alps. They had found a life of plunder and freedom right here, and they saw no reason to give it up. The longer the army remained in the rich south, feasting on captured supplies, the more appealing Crixus's vision became. Spartacus found himself in an incredibly difficult position. He was the commander-in-chief, but he was not an absolute dictator. His authority rested on the continued consent of his followers and the loyalty of his lieutenants. He could not simply order Crixus and his tens of thousands of warriors to obey. To push the issue too hard might lead to an open battle within their own camp, a civil war that would destroy them all and hand the Romans an easy victory. For now, a fragile and tense compromise was maintained. But the seeds of a future disaster had been sown. The single greatest threat to the army of Spartacus was no longer the Roman legions approaching from the north, but the conflicting dreams of freedom and revenge that were tearing it apart from within. The unity forged in the desperation of the ludus was beginning to crack under the pressure of victory. The news of the catastrophic defeat of Publius Varinius struck the city of Rome like a physical blow. This was no longer a distant rumor of a skirmish. It was a disaster unfolding in their own backyard. The reports painted a picture of utter humiliation: a Roman praetor's army shattered, his officers killed, and most shamefully of all, his symbols of office, the sacred fasces, now in the hands of a slave. The story spread through the city, from the aristocratic villas on the Palatine Hill to the crowded, filthy tenements of the Subura. The irritation of the Senate had turned to shock, and that shock was rapidly curdling into outright panic. This was a crisis of a kind Rome had not faced in Italy for over a century, not since the dark days of Hannibal's invasion. The slave army was not a distant threat. It was a victorious, marauding force that was effectively the master of southern Italy. They were a direct threat to the city's grain supply and, more importantly, to the very social order upon which the Republic was built. The idea that property could rise up and destroy its owners sent a tremor of existential fear through the Roman elite. The word latrocinium was now laughably inadequate. This was a bellum, a full-scale war, and it was a war they were losing. In an atmosphere of crisis, the Senate convened. The time for half measures and Praetorian militias was over. The state's honor, its dignitas, had been wounded, and the full authority of the Republic had to be asserted. They made a decision that signaled the gravity of the situation to the entire Roman world. For the upcoming year of 72 BC, the war against Spartacus would be the primary responsibility of both newly elected consuls. To put this in perspective, the consuls were the two most powerful men in the Republic. They were the joint heads of state, the supreme commanders of Rome's armies. Assigning both consuls to a single conflict within Italy was an extraordinary measure, reserved for only the most dire of national emergencies. It was a formal declaration that the slave rebellion was now the single greatest threat to the security of the state. The men elected to this monumental task were Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. They were not military geniuses on the level of a Scipio or a Marius, but they were seasoned, respected members of the Roman establishment. They were the system's answer to an anomaly, the embodiment of Roman order sent to crush a force of chaos. Each consul was given command of 2 fresh, disciplined legions, plus a large contingent of auxiliary troops. In total, a massive professional army of perhaps 30 to 40,000 men was being mobilized, a force vastly superior in numbers, training, and equipment to anything the rebels had yet faced. With this new army came a new, comprehensive strategy. The Roman High Command analyzed the rebels' movements and their presumed objective. Aware that Spartacus was leading his massive host northwards, they devised a classic large-scale pincer movement designed to trap and annihilate the entire rebel force. The plan was simple and logical. Lentulus, with his consular army, would march east and then north, positioning his legions to block the main route up the Italian peninsula along the Apennine Mountains. He was to be the anvil. Meanwhile, Gellius would take his army and pursue Spartacus from the south, pressing him from behind. He was to be the hammer. The strategy was designed to leave Spartacus with no options. He could not turn and fight Gellius, because Lentulus would be blocking his path of retreat. He could not try to break through Lentulus's lines, because Gellius would be right on his heels, ready to smash into his rear. Trapped between these two powerful consular armies, the massive unwieldy column of the rebel host would be pinned, surrounded, and systematically destroyed. On the military maps in Rome, the plan looked flawless. It was a strategy worthy of the Republic, methodical, overwhelming, and utterly certain of success. As the spring of 72 BC arrived, the two consuls marched their gleaming legions out of Rome, confident that they would soon erase this shameful stain on the Republic's honor. For Spartacus and his army, the time of easy victories against incompetent commanders was over. The true test, a confrontation with the full, organized might of the Roman state, was about to begin. As the spring of 72 BC breathed life back into the Italian landscape, 2 immense human rivers began to flow. From the south, the vast sprawling column of the rebel army moved northwards, a nation on the march. From Rome, the disciplined, glittering legions of 2 consular armies marched to meet them. The stage was set for a titanic collision. But before the main forces could clash, the fatal crack that had formed in the rebel leadership during the winter finally split wide open, leading to the first great tragedy of the war. The fragile compromise between Spartacus and Crixus could not hold under the pressure of the approaching Roman armies. As Spartacus began to implement his disciplined strategic withdrawal towards the Alps, Crixus openly refused to follow. Plutarch writes that Crixus, blinded by arrogance and self-confidence, could not stomach what he saw as a retreat. He and his followers had tasted victory and plunder, and they craved more. Their hatred for Rome was a fire that demanded to be fed, not carried away to a distant land. The moment for decision had arrived, and Crixus made his choice. He broke away from the main army, taking with him a massive contingent of his own loyal followers. The ancient sources suggest his independent force numbered as many as 30,000 men, composed almost entirely of Gauls and Germans who shared his thirst for vengeance and his contempt for a strategic retreat. This was not a minor defection. It was a schism that ripped the rebel army in two. While Spartacus, with the bulk of the army, continued his methodical march north along the main axis of the Apennine Mountains, Crixus led his forces east, into the rich province of Apulia, near the spur of the Italian boot. His intention was clear: to continue the campaign of plunder and to terrorize the heartlands of Roman Italy. It was a strategically disastrous move, born of pride. He had voluntarily separated himself from his only support and marched into a region where he could be easily isolated. For the Roman consul Lucius Gellius, who was advancing from the south, this was a gift from the gods of war. His primary mission was to pursue and harry the main rebel army, acting as the hammer to Lentulus' anvil. But now a huge isolated portion of that army had broken off and presented itself as a perfect target. Crixus, unlike the cautious Spartacus, was not hard to find. The path of his army was a trail of fire and destruction as they looted estates and terrorized the countryside. Gellius changed his plans. He ignored Spartacus for the moment and marched his 2 legions with all speed towards Apulia, determined to eliminate Crixus before he could rejoin the main force. The inevitable collision occurred near Mount Garganus. Crixus, for all his bravery, was a brawler, not a general. He seems to have been caught by surprise by the speed of Gellius's advance and was forced to give battle on ground chosen by the Romans. For the first time, a major rebel force would face a full, disciplined consular army in a pitched battle. Crixus and his men were ferocious fighters, hardened by months of successful combat. They met the Roman charge with a terrifying roar, and the ensuing battle was a brutal, bloody affair. The Gauls and Germans fought with the desperate courage of men who knew that defeat meant either death or a return to chains. But courage alone was no match for the methodical killing machine of 2 Roman legions. Gellius was a competent, if uninspired, commander, and he deployed his forces with textbook precision. The Roman lines held firm against the wild Gallic charges. The disciplined legionaries, protected by their large shields and fighting in tight formation, systematically cut down the less organized rebels. Crixus himself fought like a cornered lion, plunging into the thickest of the fighting, his sword reaping a heavy toll. But his individual heroism could not turn the tide. He was surrounded and killed, falling amidst the bodies of his best warriors. With their leader dead, the rebel line shattered. The battle turned into a massacre. Appian reports that 2/3 of Crixus's army, some 20,000 men, were slaughtered on the field that day. The first great victory of the war belonged to Rome. The news was received in the city with a surge of relief and celebration. It seemed that the crisis was already passing. One of the 2 main rebel leaders was dead, and a huge portion of their army had been utterly destroyed. The senators congratulated Gellius and themselves on their wise strategy. They believed the back of the rebellion was now broken. All that remained was for the second consul, Lentulus, to block the path of Spartacus's now diminished and surely demoralized force, and for Gellius to close in from behind to deliver the final crushing blow. In their minds, the war was all but won. They had, once again, fatally underestimated the man from Thrace. For as Spartacus received the grim news of Crixus's demise, he was not consumed by despair. He was filled with a cold and terrible resolve. His friend was dead, but the overconfidence of his enemies had just handed him an opportunity for a vengeance of his own. The news of Crixus's death and the annihilation of his army near Mount Garganus swept through Spartacus's camp like a bitter winter wind. It was a devastating blow. Not only had they lost a brave, if reckless, commander, but tens of thousands of their comrades had been slaughtered. For a lesser leader, this moment would have been one of despair, a confirmation that the Roman war machine was, in the end, invincible. But Spartacus was not a lesser leader. He understood his enemies. He knew that their victory would breed arrogance, and that in their arrogance, they would grow careless. The loss of Crixus was a tragedy, but the overconfidence of the consuls had just presented him with an opportunity. Spartacus continued his relentless march north, his army now a more unified, if smaller, force. Ahead of him, blocking the pass through the Apennine Mountains, was the consul Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus with his 2 legions. Lentulus was the anvil. He had established a strong defensive position and was waiting for his colleague, Gellius, to drive the rebels into his trap. He expected to face a demoralized army, its spirit broken by the news of Crixus's defeat. He was preparing to meet a wounded animal, limping towards its doom. Instead, he was about to be hit by a thunderbolt. Spartacus did not slow his pace or show any sign of hesitation. He drove his men hard, marching with a speed and purpose that astonished the Romans. Instead of trying to maneuver around Lentulus or showing any fear, he marched straight at him. The details of the ensuing battle are lost to history, but its outcome was clear and catastrophic for Rome. Spartacus, with his veteran corps of gladiators at the spearhead, did not just try to break through the consular line. He attacked it with such focused ferocity and tactical brilliance that he shattered it completely. The battle was a stunning victory for the rebels. Lentulus's legions were not just defeated. They were broken and scattered, the survivors fleeing in panic through the very mountains they were supposed to be defending. The Roman anvil had been hammered into pieces. The strategic situation had now been dramatically and violently altered. Spartacus was no longer trapped. The path to the north was wide open. A conventional general might have seized this opportunity and continued his march towards the Alps, content with his incredible victory. But Spartacus was not a conventional general, and he was not content. He had just defeated one consul. The other, Lucius Gellius, was now hurrying north, flush with his victory over Crixus, and completely unaware of his colleague's sudden demise. Gellius believed he was closing the trap on a weakened foe. In reality, he was marching headlong into an ambush of his own. In what was perhaps his most audacious and brilliant move of the entire war, Spartacus performed a stunning strategic pivot. Immediately after routing Lentulus, he turned his entire army around and marched south with incredible speed. It was a masterclass in audacity. He was marching back towards the very army that was pursuing him, using his superior mobility to force a battle on his own terms. Gellius's army was likely exhausted, their pace forced as they tried to catch Spartacus. They were marching with the careless confidence of a victor. The last thing they expected was for their fleeing quarry to turn and attack them like a cornered wolf. Spartacus found the consular army and fell upon it with the full force of his victorious legions. The Roman soldiers, weary from their march and psychologically unprepared for such a sudden, furious assault, were caught completely off balance. The rebel army, by contrast, was riding a wave of adrenaline and supreme confidence. They had just destroyed one consul. The second seemed like an inevitability. The battle was another disaster for Rome. Gellius's army, like Lentulus's before it, was crushed. The victors of Mount Garganus were now the vanquished. their celebrated legions fleeing in disarray. In the space of what may have been only a few days, a single army of former slaves, led by a Thracian gladiator, had met and comprehensively defeated both of Rome's serving consuls in separate, decisive battles. It was a humiliation on a scale that was almost inconceivable. The entire Roman strategy was in ruins. The two powerful armies that were meant to end the rebellion had ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. All of central Italy now lay open and undefended. The road to the Alps was clear, but a new, more tantalizing possibility now hung in the air: the road to Rome itself. Spartacus had not just proven he could defeat Roman armies. He had proven he was, at that moment, the single greatest military commander on the Italian peninsula. In the wake of his stunning victories over two consuls, Spartacus stood as the undisputed master of central Italy. His army, a force once derided as a gang of bandits, had proven itself superior to the best the Republic could muster. But amidst the triumph, there was a somber duty to perform. The ghost of Crixus, and the 20,000 Gauls and Germans who had fallen with him at Mount Garganus, still haunted the army. Their deaths, a direct result of their break from the main force, needed to be acknowledged. Spartacus had to honor his fallen comrade, but he would do so not in the manner of a Roman general, but in a way that was uniquely and chillingly his own. He gave no grand funeral oration. He built no towering monument of captured arms. Instead, he chose a form of tribute that would have been intimately, horrifyingly familiar to every man in his army. He decided to stage a set of funeral games, a munus in the Roman tradition, to honor the spirit of the dead. The ancient tradition of funeral games in Italy had its roots in blood sacrifice, the belief that the souls of the dead were appeased by the shedding of blood. Over the centuries, this had evolved into the highly ritualized spectacle of gladiatorial combat. Now, Spartacus would hold his own. He selected 300 of the most high-ranking and able-bodied Roman soldiers from the thousands he had just taken prisoner. These were not common legionaries. They were centurions, officers, and perhaps even young aristocrats serving their first campaign. They were the sons of the very men who sat in the Senate, the very class that owned the estates and watched gladiators die for their afternoon's entertainment. These 300 men were marched to a flat, open field, and the entire rebel army gathered to watch. The former slaves, the field hands, the herdsmen, and at the forefront, the hardened core of surviving gladiators, became the spectators. The Roman prisoners were divided into pairs and given gladiatorial weapons. We can only imagine the dawning horror on their faces as they realized what was about to happen. They, the citizens of the master race, the soldiers of the world's greatest army, were being handed the tools of the most despised profession in their society. They were being turned into the very thing they held in contempt: gladiators. The roles had been completely and grotesquely reversed. The men who had once sat in the stands, cheering for blood, were now the performers on the sand. The men who had been bred to die for sport were now the masters of the games, the editors. Spartacus and his men watched in grim silence as the Romans were forced to fight. Some may have refused, only to be cut down by the rebel guards. Others, perhaps hoping to survive, or driven by the instinct of their own warrior training, fought with a desperate ferocity. Roman fought Roman, citizen fought citizen, their blood soaking the Italian soil not for the glory of the Republic, but for the grim satisfaction of their former property. This was not entertainment. It was a chilling parody, a dark and bloody ritual. For the rebels, especially the former gladiators, this was not a spectacle of pleasure. It was the exorcism of a collective trauma. They were forcing their masters to experience a taste of the horror that had been their daily reality. This act was Spartacus's most profound and terrifying message to Rome. It was an act of psychological warfare far more devastating than the defeat of their legions. He was holding up a mirror to Roman society and forcing it to gaze upon its own monstrous reflection. He was taking their most beloved form of entertainment, the ritualized killing of human beings for sport, and turning it back upon them. The message was clear and unambiguous. The world you have created, built on our pain and suffering, is now your own prison. The cruelty you have institutionalized will now be your own punishment. Nothing you hold sacred is safe from us, because you have taught us that nothing is sacred. This event would have sent a new wave of terror through Rome, a fear deeper than just military defeat. Spartacus was no longer just a brilliant general. He was a figure of righteous vengeance, a man who seemed intent not just on defeating Rome, but on systematically dismantling its cultural and moral foundations. After the grim ceremony was complete and the ghost of Crixus had been honored in blood, Spartacus refocused on his strategic goal. He had avenged his fallen friend and punished his enemies in a manner they would never forget. His army, now unified and battle-hardened, resumed its inexorable march north. The path to the Alps, the gateway to freedom, was completely open. He had defeated everyone Rome had sent against him. He had achieved his objective. His epic journey seemed to be reaching its logical, triumphant conclusion. The army of Spartacus marched through the rich plains of the Po Valley, a victorious, unstoppable tide. Behind them lay the wreckage of 4 Roman armies. Before them lay only one final, minor obstacle. The province of Cisalpine Gaul, the region of northern Italy just south of the Alps, was governed by a proconsul named Gaius Cassius Longinus. Panicked by the approach of this seemingly invincible slave army, Cassius gathered what forces he could muster, likely a single legion and some local levies, and tried to block their path near the town of Mutina. For the Romans, the result was depressingly familiar. For the rebels, it was another day's work. The battle was a disaster for Cassius. His legion was mauled, his lines broken, and he himself was nearly killed in the fighting, escaping with his life only through the discipline of his retreating guard. The last organized Roman army in their path had been swept aside. Now there was nothing. No legions, no consuls, no fortifications. Before them, rising up like a jagged wall separating Italy from the rest of Europe, stood the Alps. This was the moment. This was the goal towards which Spartacus had been driving his army for almost a year. It was the culmination of his entire strategy. Freedom was no longer an abstract dream whispered in the darkness of a ludus. It was a physical reality, a geographical landmark they could see with their own eyes. They had only to take the final step, to make the arduous but achievable climb through the mountain passes. Once on the other side, the promise of a return home would become real. Their long, bloody war against the Roman Republic would be over. They had won. And then, at the very threshold of salvation, in the most baffling and fateful decision of the entire war, they stopped. They stood at the gateway to freedom, looked upon it, and turned around. The entire army, a force of perhaps 120,000 people, reversed its direction and began the long march south, back into the heart of the Italian peninsula they had just fought so hard to escape. Why? This question has haunted historians for 2 millennia. It is the central, maddening enigma of Spartacus's story. The ancient sources themselves are unclear, suggesting that even at the time, the decision was a subject of confusion and debate. We are left with several compelling, and not mutually exclusive possibilities. The most widely accepted theory is that Spartacus, once again, became a captive of his own success. He was a general, but he was not a king. His army was a volatile democracy of the sword, and he could not command it against its collective will. His followers, particularly the large contingents of Gauls and Germans, may have simply refused to go any further. They were not marching towards an abstract ideal of freedom. They were living it. They were masters of Italy. They were rich with plunder. Their bellies were full of Italian wine, and their hearts were full of the intoxicating pride of conquerors. The thought of abandoning all this for a grueling march across the Alps, only to return to a life of hardscrabble farming in their damp northern forests, must have seemed like madness. The ghost of Crixus and his desire for vengeance and plunder had, it seems, finally triumphed over the strategic wisdom of Spartacus. A second possibility is more pragmatic and logistical. It may have been late in the campaigning season. The prospect of leading an enormous column, which included tens of thousands of non-combatant women, children, and elderly, through the treacherous, snow-choked passes of the Alps as winter approached would have been a monumental risk. Such an undertaking could have easily turned into a disaster, a frozen, starving catastrophe far worse than any Roman legion. In this view, Spartacus was not overruled. He made a calculated, albeit tragic, decision as a responsible leader, choosing the known danger of the Romans over the certain disaster of the mountains. The third and most dramatic possibility is that Spartacus himself had a change of heart. Perhaps after destroying 4 Roman armies in a row, after seeing both consuls of the Republic flee before him, he began to believe in his own invincibility. Perhaps he began to believe he could do more than just escape Rome. He could break it. His objective may have shifted from mere survival to outright revolution. The initial plan to escape had been born of desperation. Now, standing at the peak of his power, he may have developed a new, more ambitious plan: to march south to threaten Rome itself, and to ignite a peninsula-wide war that would shatter the slave-holding republic forever. Whatever the reason, a rebellious army, logistical necessity, or a shift in his own ambition, the decision was made. The great army turned its back on freedom and marched south. This single act was the greatest gift they could have possibly given their terrified enemies in Rome. It gave them the one resource they had run out of and desperately needed: time. Time to recover from the shock of their defeats. Time to raise new legions. And most importantly, time to set aside the failed consuls and find a new kind of commander. A man with the wealth, the ruthlessness, and the burning ambition necessary to confront the seemingly unstoppable gladiator. The war was not over. It was about to enter its final and most brutal chapter. The news that Spartacus had turned back from the Alps was received in Rome with a mixture of disbelief and profound relief. No one understood why the rebels had thrown away their chance at freedom, but no one was questioning their good fortune. The inexplicable decision had bought the Republic what it needed most: a second chance. The immediate existential threat of an attack on the city had passed, but the deeper crisis remained. The consular armies of 72 BC were in disgrace, their commanders humiliated. The rebel army, though seemingly aimless, was still at large, a cancerous tumor in the heart of Italy. A political vacuum had opened up. The command of the war against Spartacus had become a cursed chalice. No respectable senator wanted to be the next name on the long list of defeated commanders. To fail against a foreign king was one thing. To be outgeneraled by a gladiator was a stain that could end a career. Into this vacuum of fear and hesitation stepped the one man in Rome whose ambition was greater than his fear of disgrace: Marcus Licinius Crassus. We have met him before, the young man who saw opportunity in the terror of Sulla's proscriptions. Now, he was in his prime, the wealthiest man in the Republic and perhaps the entire Mediterranean world. His fortune was legendary, built on silver mines, vast agricultural estates, and most notoriously, his ruthless real estate empire in Rome. But Crassus understood a fundamental truth of Roman society. Wealth alone did not command the ultimate respect. True power, true prestige, the revered quality of dignitas, came from military glory. And in this, Crassus was painfully deficient. His entire life was lived in the shadow of his great rival, Gnaeus Pompey. While Crassus had been meticulously building his fortune, the younger Pompey had been building a legend. Pompey had celebrated triumphs, earned the cognomen Magnus or the Great, and was adored by the people as Rome's premier military hero. Crassus, by contrast, was seen by his aristocratic peers as little more than a glorified slumlord, a man whose talents lay in spreadsheets and auctions, not on the battlefield. This deep-seated envy was the furnace that fueled his every action. He desperately needed a war, a great and dangerous war, that would allow him to prove he was Pompey's equal. The war against Spartacus, the command that everyone else feared, was the ultimate gamble, a high-risk investment that could finally yield the prestige he craved. He went before the panicked Senate and volunteered to take command. He did not ask for the position. He demanded it, projecting an aura of confidence that the city desperately needed. He promised not just to contain the rebellion, but to utterly exterminate it. The senators, desperate and out of options, readily agreed. They appointed Crassus as a praetor with proconsular authority, giving him sweeping powers to conduct the war as he saw fit. He was given command of the 6 new legions that had been raised for the year, and he was also allowed to take over the shattered, demoralized remnants of the 2 consular armies. In total, he now commanded a colossal force of 8 legions, over 40,000 professional soldiers. But Crassus brought more to the war than just men. He brought his immense personal fortune. He understood that an army's loyalty could be bought. He used his own money to supplement the state's funding, ensuring his soldiers were the best equipped and best supplied in the field. He promised them lavish bonuses upon victory. This act transformed the nature of the army. These soldiers were not just fighting for the Republic. They were fighting for Marcus Crassus. Their loyalty was to him, their benefactor, as much as to the state. He was building a private army, a tool of personal ambition, in a way that foreshadowed the very men who would eventually bring the Republic to its knees. The war had now fundamentally changed. It was no longer a state struggling to put down a rebellion. It had become a deeply personal duel between 2 extraordinary men. In one corner stood Spartacus, the Thracian slave, a military genius who fought for the abstract revolutionary ideal of freedom. In the other stood Crassus, the Roman oligarch, a master of capital who fought for the deeply personal traditional ideal of glory. It was a clash between a man who had nothing and a man who had everything but the one thing he truly wanted. Crassus was not like Glaber or the Consuls. He would not underestimate his opponent. He recognized Spartacus as a formidable adversary, and he knew that to defeat him, he would have to be more disciplined, more methodical, and infinitely more ruthless than any commander who had come before. His first task was not to fight the enemy, but to terrorize his own men into a state of absolute, unthinking obedience. When Marcus Crassus formally took command, he did not inherit a proud and disciplined fighting force. He inherited an army infected with fear. The legions he absorbed from the defeated consuls were psychologically broken. These were soldiers who had thrown down their weapons and run, not from barbarian hordes, but from an army of slaves. They had seen their centurions cut down and their eagles, the sacred standards of the legion, nearly captured. They were demoralized, insubordinate, and worst of all, they were terrified of Spartacus. They spoke his name with a kind of superstitious awe. Crassus knew that before he could ever hope to defeat the enemy in the field, he first had to defeat the enemy within his own ranks. He needed to excise the cancer of fear, and he chose to do so with the surgeon's knife of absolute terror. His opportunity came quickly. He sent one of his legates, a man named Mummius, with 2 legions to shadow the army of Spartacus. His orders were explicit and delivered with the full weight of his authority. Observe the enemy, follow them, report on their movements, but under no circumstances were they to engage in battle. Mummius, however, was a man cut from the same cloth as so many Roman aristocrats. He was ambitious and saw a chance for personal glory. Seeing what he believed was a perfect opportunity to attack a straggling portion of the rebel army, he ignored his commander's direct order and launched a full-scale assault. The result was a predictable disaster. Spartacus, ever the master of the battlefield, turned on Mummius's legions and thrashed them soundly. Once again, Roman soldiers broke ranks and fled in a humiliating rout. For Mummius, it was a disgrace. For Crassus, It was the perfect pretext. When the defeated legions straggled back to the main camp, they found not a sympathetic commander, but a cold, unforgiving judge. Crassus assembled the entire army. He then ordered the soldiers of the cohorts that had been the first to break and run to be brought forward. He announced that he was reviving an ancient and terrible form of military punishment, one so brutal it had not been used in the Roman army for centuries. Decimation. The word itself means removal of a tenth. The procedure was a chilling exercise in disciplined terror. Crassus selected 500 soldiers who had shown the greatest cowardice. These 500 were then divided into 50 groups of 10. Within each group of 10, the soldiers were forced to draw lots. For 9 of them, the lot meant survival. For the 10th man, it meant death. But he was not to be executed by a professional soldier. The remaining 9 men in his group, his own friends, his tentmates, the men he had marched and fought beside, were forced to become his executioners. They were given clubs and stones and ordered to beat their own comrade to death, in full view of the rest of the horrified army. 50 men were bludgeoned to death that day, not by the enemy, but by their own brothers in arms. The psychological impact of this act cannot be overstated. It was a message of terrifying clarity, burned into the mind of every single soldier. The logic of Crassus's terror was absolute. Cowardice in the face of the enemy might lead to your death. Disobedience to Marcus Crassus would definitely lead to your death, and it would be a shameful, brutal end delivered by the hands of your closest friends. He had brilliantly and brutally recalibrated their fear. From that day forward, the soldiers of the army feared their own commander far more than they would ever fear Spartacus. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, terrified obedience. The army that had been a demoralized rabble was now a silent, disciplined, and lethally motivated instrument of his will. Crassus had reforged his legions in a crucible of blood and terror. His weapon was now sharp. It was time to point it at the enemy. With his army reforged into a weapon of terrifying obedience, Marcus Crassus began to hunt Spartacus in earnest. But he did not offer the rebels the gift of a single decisive battle. He was far too cunning for that. Crassus was a master of logistics and attrition, a businessman applying the principles of a hostile takeover to the field of war. He initiated a new phase of the conflict, a relentless, grinding pursuit. His legions did not charge headlong into the rebel host. Instead, they shadowed them, a constant, menacing presence. They attacked foraging parties, cut off stragglers, and engaged in sharp, bloody skirmishes, but always pulled back before a full-scale battle could develop. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, a slow strangulation designed to bleed the rebel army dry, to wear down their morale, and to starve them into submission. Spartacus, for the first time in the war, found himself on the defensive. He was no longer facing incompetent fools who blundered into his traps. He was facing a patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless opponent who matched him in strategic thinking. As his army marched south through the Italian peninsula, hounded every step of the way by Crassus, he saw his options narrowing. He could not afford to be caught in a war of attrition. His army, a nomadic nation, lacked the stable supply lines and endless reserves of manpower that Crassus could call upon. He needed to change the game entirely. He needed a new sanctuary, a new base of operations where he could turn and fight on his own terms. And so, he conceived of a new, brilliant strategic gambit. He would leave Italy altogether. He set his sights on the island of Sicily. The choice was a stroke of genius. Sicily was the perfect destination for 3 critical reasons. First, it was the breadbasket of the Republic, a land of immense agricultural wealth. Once there, his army's chronic food shortages would be over. Second, as we have seen, the island had a deep and bitter history of slave rebellion. The stories of the 2 great servile wars were still whispered among the vast slave populations of the Sicilian latifundia. Spartacus could be confident that his arrival would ignite a third, and far larger, rebellion, potentially adding tens of thousands of new motivated fighters to his cause. Finally, and most importantly, Sicily was an island. If he could transport his army across the narrow Strait of Messina and secure the coastal towns, he could create an impregnable island fortress. The Romans, with their land-based army, would find it incredibly difficult to dislodge him. He could transform his rebellion from a running battle into a permanent breakaway kingdom of the free. There was only one monumental obstacle. Spartacus had an army of infantry, not a navy. To cross the Strait of Messina, he needed ships, and he had none. But at this time, the Mediterranean Sea was the hunting ground of another of Rome's great enemies, the Cilician pirates. These were not the scattered bands of thugs we imagine today. They were a highly organized and powerful naval force, a veritable pirate kingdom with its own bases, its own fleets, and its own intelligence network. They terrorized Roman shipping with impunity and were a constant thorn in the side of the Republic. As the saying went, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," and Spartacus saw in these sea lords a potential, if treacherous, partner. He sent envoys to make contact with the pirate fleet that was then operating off the Italian coast. He made them an offer they couldn't refuse. He offered them a king's ransom, a vast sum of gold and silver from the plunder his army had accumulated, in exchange for a simple service: to transport his army across the strait to Sicily. The plan was to start with an initial force of 2,000 men, who could then secure a beachhead for the rest of the army to follow. The pirates, their greed piqued by the prospect of so much wealth for what seemed like a relatively simple task, agreed to the deal. They took a substantial down payment and promised to return with their ships under the cover of a designated night. A current of hope and excitement surged through the rebel camp. The army marched to the very toe of Italy, to the coast near Rhegium, and waited. As night fell, thousands of men would have stood on the shores of Bruttium, gazing across the narrow, dark strip of water at the twinkling lights of Sicily on the other side. It was the light of a promised land, the future of their revolution. They waited for the sight of sails on the horizon, for the sound of muffled oars that would carry them to their new destiny. But the ships never came. The hours of the night ticked by in tense, and then agonizing silence. The horizon remained empty. As the first gray light of dawn broke, the bitter truth became undeniable. The Cilician pirates had taken his gold and vanished into the night. They had betrayed him. Why they did so is a matter of historical debate. Perhaps they were simply pirates acting as pirates, taking the easy money with no intention of ever fulfilling their dangerous bargain. More likely, they were bought off. The Roman governor of Sicily at the time was the notoriously corrupt Gaius Verres, and it is probable that he, or Crassus himself, paid the pirates an even larger sum to simply sail away. Or perhaps the pirates, on reflection, simply decided that while cheating Rome was profitable, directly aiding an army that was being hunted by the formidable Marcus Crassus was a risk not worth taking. Whatever their reason, their betrayal was absolute. The dream of a new kingdom in Sicily was dead, and Spartacus now found himself in the most dangerous position of his life. He had led his entire nation to the end of the world, with the impassable sea at his back and the iron legions of Marcus Crassus closing in for the kill. The perfect escape route had just become the perfect trap. The betrayal of the pirates was absolute. For Spartacus and his army, crowded onto the beaches of Bruttium, it was a strategic catastrophe. For Marcus Crassus, observing from a distance, it was the perfect checkmate. He saw his opponent cornered, his grand plan in ruins, trapped at the very end of the Italian peninsula. A lesser general might have seen this as the moment to charge in, to seek a final, glorious battle and crush the rebellion with a single blow. But Crassus was not a lesser general. He was a patient predator, and he had no intention of granting the rebels the dignity of a warrior's death in open combat. He sought not just to defeat them, but to unmake them, to let them rot from within. He conceived of a plan of such staggering scale and brutal simplicity that it remains one of the most audacious feats of military engineering in history. He decided to build a prison whose walls would be the very landscape of Italy itself. His plan was to completely seal off the Bruttium Peninsula, trapping Spartacus's entire army within it. He identified the narrowest point of the peninsula's neck, a stretch of land that ran from the Tyrrhenian Sea on one side to the Ionian Sea on the other. Across this isthmus, he ordered his army to construct a massive wall and ditch. This was not a mere field fortification. It was a monumental undertaking. According to the historian Plutarch, the structure stretched for over 300 stadia, a distance of nearly 60 kilometers or 35 miles. First, the legions were ordered to dig a ditch of breathtaking proportions, 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep. The sheer volume of earth and rock that had to be moved by hand is almost impossible to comprehend. Behind this enormous trench, the soldiers then erected a towering rampart, a wall of earth and timber, crowned with watchtowers and fortifications. The legions of Rome, the most formidable fighting force on earth, were transformed into the world's most disciplined construction crew. Day and night, for weeks on end, the work was relentless. The rhythmic thud of tens of thousands of pickaxes striking the earth, the shouts of the centurions directing the labor, the groaning of wagons hauling timber, this was the new sound of the war. It was a testament to the iron discipline Crassus had instilled in his men. They did not question the back-breaking labor. They obeyed. Their fear of their commander was a greater motivator than any exhaustion. For the rebels, watching from the south, this must have been a spectacle of psychological horror. Every day, they could see the line of the wall stretching further across the landscape, a physical manifestation of their doom. It was a relentless, creeping barrier, a line being drawn across the world that separated them from all hope of escape. The wall was a physical barrier, but its true purpose was strategic starvation. Crassus was not trying to stop an army. He was trying to contain a plague and let it burn itself out. The wall was designed to cut off Spartacus's ability to forage for supplies. The resources within the peninsula were finite, and with an army of over 100,000 people, they would be consumed with terrifying speed. Finally, the immense project was completed. The wall stood, a scar carved across the face of Italy, a monument to Roman power and Crassus's cold, calculating will. The trap was now locked. The winter of 72 to 71 BC began to descend, bringing with it cold rains and dwindling hope. Inside the vast prison of the Bruttium Peninsula, the rebel army began to starve. Crassus, in his fortified camp on the northern side of the wall, simply waited. He made no move to attack. He had built his cage, and now he watched with the patience of a spider as the prey inside grew weaker and more desperate. His greatest ally was now time, and his most effective weapon was the gnawing hunger in every rebel belly. Inside the vast prison of the Bruttium Peninsula, the silence of starvation had taken hold. The winter of 71 BC was cruel and unforgiving. The rebel army, which had once feasted on the spoils of victory, was now reduced to digging for roots and hunting what little game remained. Disease and despair were as deadly as any Roman sword. From his camp on the other side of the wall, Marcus Crassus watched and waited, confident that his great work of engineering would deliver him a slow, bloodless victory. He had built an unbreachable barrier, but he had failed to account for the two forces that Spartacus wielded better than any other commander: the ingenuity of the human will and the fury of a winter storm. While Crassus watched his wall, Spartacus watched the sky. He waited for nature itself to provide him with cover. His moment came during one of the fiercest nights of the winter, a night of driving snow and howling winds that reduced visibility to near zero. Under the cloak of this shrieking blizzard, he put his desperate, brilliant plan into motion. He gathered a portion of his army at one of the most remote and lightly guarded sections of Crassus's line. Their task was to bridge the unbridgeable ditch. In the freezing darkness, whipped by the storm, the rebels worked with a frantic, silent energy. They had no proper engineering tools. They used their bare hands, their shields, and whatever they could find to fill the 15-foot chasm. They threw in earth, rocks, and heavy tree branches. In a grim testament to their desperation, some ancient sources darkly suggest they even threw in the bodies of their own fallen comrades and captured prisoners, creating a ghastly, frozen bridge of flesh and timber. When a narrow causeway had been formed, Spartacus led the assault. They swarmed across the makeshift bridge and fell upon the wall. The Roman sentries, blinded by the snow and deafened by the wind, were caught completely by surprise. A vicious, chaotic battle erupted in the heart of the storm. The breakout was a success, but a costly one. It was not a clean escape. The Romans, now fully alerted, rushed reinforcements to the breach. In the brutal fighting that followed, thousands of rebels were killed. According to Plutarch, only a third of Spartacus's army, perhaps 40,000 men, managed to break through the lines and escape the trap. The rest were either killed or left behind, their fate sealed. Spartacus was free again, his army lean and hardened, but this victory, born of desperation, bred a fatal arrogance in some of his followers. History repeated itself in the most tragic way. A large contingent of Gauls and Germans, under the command of two lieutenants named Garganus and Castus, grew overconfident. Believing themselves invincible after the breakout, they broke away from Spartacus to conduct their own campaign of plunder. Crassus, though enraged by the escape, was a predator who knew how to exploit a wounded enemy. He immediately saw his chance. He fell upon the isolated force of Garganus and Castus with the full weight of his legions. The Gauls and Germans fought with incredible bravery, but they were caught in the open, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. They were annihilated. But even as Crassus savored this victory, his own time was running out. In Rome, the Senate had lost patience. Fearing that Crassus, too, would fail, they had taken the extraordinary step of recalling Rome's two other great generals. Gnaeus Pompey the Great was returning with his victorious legions from Spain. At the same time, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, fresh from his victories against Mithridates in the east, had just landed with his army at Brundisium, on the heel of Italy. For Crassus, it was now a desperate race for glory. He had to destroy Spartacus before Pompey could arrive and steal his prize. For Spartacus, the walls of the world were closing in. He was now trapped between three Roman armies. He made a desperate dash for Brundisium, perhaps hoping to seize the port and escape across the sea, but found his path blocked by the newly arrived Lucullus. There was no escape. To the north was Pompey. To the east, Lucullus. And behind him, hungry for the kill, was his oldest and most hated foe, Marcus Crassus. With nowhere left to run, Spartacus made his final decision. He turned his army around to face his pursuer and give battle. The final apocalyptic confrontation of the war took place in April of 71 BC, near the headwaters of the Salaris River. Spartacus knew this was the end. As his men formed their lines, his horse was brought to him. In a dramatic and symbolic act, he drew his sword and killed the animal in front of his entire army. "If I am victorious," he declared, "I will have many horses. If I am defeated, I will not need one." He was telling his men that there would be no retreat. This was a battle for victory or death. His one burning objective in the chaos of the battle was to fight his way through the Roman lines and kill Marcus Crassus with his own hands. With a small, elite bodyguard, he plunged into the very heart of the enemy legion, a man possessed. The ancient writers describe his final moments as a heroic epic. He was a whirlwind of destruction, cutting down any Roman who stood in his path. He killed 2 centurions who tried to stop him. He was wounded in the thigh by a spear, forced to drop to one knee. But even then he did not yield. Holding his shield before him, he continued to fight from the ground, a wounded lion surrounded by hunters, until he was finally overwhelmed by a tide of steel and cut to pieces. With the death of their leader, the rebel army, fighting with a courage that even their enemies admired, finally broke. The battle became a slaughter. The Third Servile War was over. In the bloody chaos of the battlefield, the Romans searched for the body of their great adversary, the slave who had made their republic tremble. But it was never found. Spartacus, the man, had vanished into the carnage, leaving only a legend behind. The death of Spartacus on the battlefield was an end, but it was not the end. For the thousands of his followers who were captured alive after the final battle, a fate far more terrible than a swift death in combat awaited them. Marcus Crassus had won his war, but his victory was incomplete. He needed to make an example, to deliver a message of such overwhelming terror that the very thought of a slave rebellion would be permanently burned from the world's memory. He found his canvas on the most famous road in the Roman world, the Appian Way. The 6,000 captured rebels were not granted the mercy of a quick execution. Instead, Crassus ordered them all to be crucified. But this was not a simple mass execution. It was a meticulously staged theatrical production of horror. The crosses were erected at regular intervals along the entire length of the Appian Way, stretching for over 120 miles from the gates of Capua, where the rebellion had begun, all the way to the gates of Rome itself. For weeks and perhaps months, anyone traveling to or from the capital city was forced to bear witness to this grotesque spectacle. They journeyed through an avenue of agonizing, dying men, their groans a constant soundtrack of Roman retribution. It was not just a punishment. It was a warning, a piece of political terror art written in human suffering. The message was simple. This is what happens to property that forgets its place. Crassus had his victory, but the glory he had craved was ultimately sullied. His rival, Pompey the Great, marching down from the north, encountered a disorganized band of 5,000 rebels who had escaped the final battle. Pompey easily trapped and slaughtered them. He then sent a boastful letter to the Senate, declaring that while Crassus may have defeated the gladiators in open battle, he, Pompey, had extirpated the war by the roots. It was a shameless theft of credit that infuriated Crassus and deepened the rivalry that would help to dismantle the Republic. Crassus was granted only a minor triumph, an ovation, because his victory had been against an unworthy foe. The Roman elite, even in victory, could not bring themselves to fully acknowledge the greatness of the slave who had so nearly destroyed them. And so the man died, his followers were executed, and his rebellion was crushed. By every conventional measure, he was a failure. He did not free the slaves. He did not overthrow the Republic. He did not even manage to escape Italy. But the story of Spartacus is the ultimate proof that a historical legacy is not always measured in victories and defeats. Sometimes it is measured in the power of an idea. Even his enemies, the Romans who wrote his history, could not help but portray him with a grudging admiration. They called him a bandit and a deserter, but they also acknowledged his courage, his intelligence, and a quality of gentleness that seemed to contradict his violent profession. They compared him to Hannibal, the greatest enemy Rome had ever known, because like Hannibal, he had made the eternal city no fear. For centuries after his death, his name faded into the quiet pages of history. But he was reawakened in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, when thinkers like Voltaire saw him not as a mere rebel, but as a universal symbol of the fight against tyranny and oppression. But it was Karl Marx in the 19th century who transformed him into a modern icon. Marx called Spartacus the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history, seeing his uprising as the first great class war, a heroic struggle of the proletariat against their exploiters. This rebranding cemented his status as a revolutionary hero for the 20th century and beyond. German communists led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht named their movement the Spartacus League. In the Soviet Union, Sports clubs and city streets bore his name. And in Cold War America, his story became a powerful allegory for the fight for individual freedom against an oppressive state. The legendary scene in Stanley Kubrick's 1960 film, where each captured slave rises to proclaim, "I am Spartacus," to protect their leader, became an immortal hymn to human solidarity and defiance. Crassus thought he was ending the story by nailing 6,000 bodies to crosses. He was wrong. He was merely writing its final bloody chapter and ensuring it would never be forgotten. He had defeated the man, but in doing so, he had created a legend. The body of the Thracian warrior was never found, but it no longer mattered. Spartacus is more than a man now. He is an idea. He is the eternal, unquenchable proof that the human spirit can be enslaved, it can be imprisoned, and it can be killed, but it can never be truly conquered, because the yearning to be free is the most powerful force in human history.